Oh, hello everyone. How are you doing today? What's new? Just trying to get the camera in the right spot. What's new, folks? How's the world doing? Always a pleasure to talk with this community. Folks, I'm so glad to be with you here tonight. It's always a pleasure to interact with you. I've got plenty of orange juice. We got plenty to discuss tonight. Before we get to that, now is the time, if you haven't done so already, to hit the subscribe button. I know for a fact that roughly 18% of you have not subscribed. So for those 18% who are watching who haven't subscribed, be sure to hit the subscribe button. And those of you who are subscribed, perhaps you're not getting notifications, so be sure to hit the notifications bell. Make sure that you hit the notifications bell, so every time we do this, you get a little notification and come on board. And now is also the time to hit the like button. Now is also the time to tweet this out, put this on your Facebook, put this on your Twitter, put this on Reddit. Make this a bigger community, bring people on board. It's always more fun the more people are here. Our community is really growing, folks. The number of people that are tuning into these broadcasts just keeps going up. Just keeps going up. 18%, not 80%. Red Duran Dion. 18%. I will be talking about Kanye West. Right? For those who aren't aware, Kanye West has announced he's running for president of the United States. I guess before we jump into what I was going to talk about, I'll just comment on that a little bit. What's going on there? Why is Kanye West running for president of the United States? Some people say it's just an ego trip. Some people say that it is more than that, that this is a Donald Trump conspiracy to take the African-American vote away from Joe Biden, that Kanye West will talk about issues like mass incarceration and Joe Biden's ugly record when it comes to race and take votes away from him so Trump wins. Other people say Kanye isn't even serious, that he's just filling out forms. He hasn't even filled out the forms yet, and this is just a publicity stunt, and he'll announce he's not doing it. So there are many different conspiracy theories about why Kanye West tweeted out that he was running for president, if he's serious, if he isn't. So we shall see. I recall watching the Kanye West Oval Office appearance and not being too impressed with either Trump or Kanye West. It seemed like a lot of airtime filling stupidity. But I mean, at least he did talk about that. I see Kinky is asking about Epstein, Israel, and Dershowitz. Yes, I will definitely put that on the super chat lists. And by the way, before I jump into things, our new format is I will address the super chats. I'm writing down Kinky's Epstein, Israel, Dershowitz. And if you have something you want me to talk about, I will give you an answer if you give me a super chat. So keep that in mind as we start rolling into things. I already addressed Kanye West, but I will be addressing the rest of the super chats after I do my opening remarks, and then we'll do our roll call and give everyone a shout out. And then Gorbachev, USSR, writing it down. And then after that, I plan to read to you the introduction to the Green Book. I'm going to read to you my introduction to Gaddafi's classic. And then after that, we'll go from there. So the order is my opening remarks, then the roll call, then the super chats, then I read you the introduction to the Green Book. So it should be a fun evening tonight. And remember, super chats, I'll talk to you about anything you want. I may not give you the answer that you want to hear. Hezbollah will not give you the answer that you may want, but I will give you an answer to your super chats. So let me take another sip. Bundism. Let me give you Let me take another sip. And now, we'll jump right into it. So, folks, on a serious note, people have probably seen the video of the car that was driven in to protesters, plowed at high speed into protesters yesterday in Seattle. We understand that one of the protesters who was hit by the car died. And, you know, the image of this young woman who died has been going around. And it's a very serious situation. Now, in this case, we understand this was done by an individual. It wasn't done by the police. It wasn't done by the government. It was done by an individual, according to the reports that we're seeing, who drove his car into the protesters in Seattle at high speed and killed one of them and injured some others. Very serious situation. But it's not the first case. It is absolutely not the first case. You know, we know that in Kentucky, there were police who opened fire into some protesters. We know that in Detroit, someone drove up to a protest and shot into the protest and killed at least one person, injured many others. We know that in Iowa, Korean War. We know that in Iowa, there was, an individual who was shot participating in the protests. The murderer was not charged, was released without charges. And around the country, there have been protesters who have been killed. And the mainstream media of the United States is not giving us a body count. They're not telling us how many protesters have been killed. A large number of protesters have been killed. We don't know how many that is. I'm telling you a few instances. Nicaragua, Ortega. I'm giving you a few instances that I'm aware of, but there's more than that. Protesters have been killed in the last few months. Mainstream media is not commenting on it. They cover it for a little bit, and then they don't cover it. Now, this latest death is getting more publicity. We saw Kamala Harris tweeted about it and others, but it's not getting any publicity. It really, for the most part, there should be a body count. There should be a body count. We should know. We should absolutely, positively know how many protesters have been killed and who killed them. But the mainstream media is not doing that. The mainstream media is not doing that. Billionaires writing down. We don't know the death toll of the protests that are taking place. And that should be a source of outrage. Don't you think if there were people in China who were killed for protesting, we'd be given, the U.S. mainstream media would do its best to at least give us an estimate or a number of how many people had died? Don't you think if there were protests happening, in Venezuela, the government would at least give us, a number of how many people have died? We don't have a number. We don't have a number of how many people have been killed for protesting in the United States of America. During the 1960s, there were a couple occasions in which people died at protests, right? There was a protest in South Carolina, I believe, against segregation, where the police opened fire on the peaceful marchers, shot them. There was the People's Park Rebellion in Berkeley, California, and an individual named James Rector was participating, and the National Guard shot him and killed him. That was in Berkeley, California. And then there was the Kent State Massacre of 1970, where 4 students were killed when the National Guard opened fire on an unarmed crowd in Kent, Ohio, Kent State University, that were protesting the Vietnam War. 2 of the students who were killed were protesters. 2 were random students who were hit by stray bullets. We know about those deaths. But it seems like the mainstream media is doing its best to not acknowledge how many people have been killed. And thank you, Jacobs. How many people have been killed in the latest rounds of protests? Multipolarity. Mainstream media seems to be not highlighting how many people have been killed. We just don't have that information. It's not rolling in. And it's a serious concern. I mean, you can bet that if at the Tea Party, when the Tea Party was happening, when the Republicans were all being called into the streets by Fox News to protest against Barack Obama, you can bet that if a Tea Partier had been shot and killed, Fox News would have been all over it. There would have been biopic movies about their life. We would have heard that the evil socialist Obama, who was both a Muslim and a communist and a fascist, had ruthlessly taken the life of this patriotic America. They would have played it up. But you'll notice that CNN and MSNBC, that seem to be a bit more sympathetic to these protests around Black Lives Matter, they're not talking about the number of people that have been killed. I don't know the total number. I have noted a number of incidents around the country. Like I mentioned, there was Seattle, there was Kentucky, there was Iowa, there was Detroit, but there's more than that. I don't know the official number of how many people have died at protests in the last few months, but there seems to be a desire to make sure that that doesn't become the conversation topic. We know how many people have died from COVID-19. There are people that quibble about those numbers and say, well, some people say those numbers are too low because there are people who die of something else, and then they say it was COVID-19. There are people who say those numbers are too high because these people die of something else and they call it COVID-19. Regardless, right? Regardless, we have at least some numbers of people who died from COVID-19. When there's a terrorist attack, they immediately come out with a body count. This many people died. I want the body count of how many people have died for protesting in the United States. How many people have been shot or otherwise killed by police? How many people have been killed by right-wingers who attack these protests? We know that in Ohio, there was a young woman, Sarah Grossman, and she was at a protest, and she was pepper sprayed, and the pepper spray triggered her asthma, and she died as a result of that. The police took her life. They killed her, right? Because they pepper sprayed her. She was pepper sprayed, killed by pepper spray. That happened. Now, there are these little incidents we hear. There are these little incidents we hear about. But mainstream media is not coming out with a body count. It is not giving us a number of how many people have actually died in the last few months. Great Chinese leaders. And they owe us that number. We should know. We should know how many people have been killed. And the fact that mainstream media is not doing that shows they have an agenda. Because it doesn't make the United States look good around the world. The United States is supposed to be the land of freedom, the land of unlimited liberty and justice for all. And the fact that people are being killed for exercising their constitutional right to peaceably assemble for redress of grievances, that's in the First Amendment of the Constitution, that should be, something that really kind of blows a big hole in the narrative about the United States being this land of freedom and opportunity. Right? And, of course, part of the way that coups and military regime change operations and attempts to overthrow governments around the world are covered up is usually while there's violence going on in the country, they have peaceful protests that are covered, right? In Syria, right? A violent civil war by Wahhabi extremists has been going on. But when it started, there were some peaceful protests happening in Syria as well. And the U.S. media made it look like the revolution was simply peaceful protesters. Same thing happened in Libya, right? To set the stage for the NATO overthrow of the Libyan government, the United States government and covert operations staged peaceful protests in Libya and then claimed that the Libyan government was cracking down on them, right? So this claim that governments are unfair to peaceful protesters, they use it against every geopolitical rival of the United States. Any country that they don't like, they immediately find ways of accusing them of being unfair to protesters. That's standard. Venezuela, right? Venezuela, Russia, China. It's a big part of the U.S. international narrative is that, this regime that we don't like is being unfair to peaceful protesters. However, We know for a fact that a number of protesters have been killed across the country in protests that have taken place. In these Black Lives Matter demonstrations, in the protests following the death of George Floyd, a number of American citizens have lost their lives. And mainstream media refuses to give us a number. How many people were killed because they went to a rally protesting police brutality and racism in the United States? How many people were killed? We know someone was killed in Seattle. We know people were killed in Detroit. We know Sarah Grossman was killed in Ohio. We know someone was killed in Kentucky. We know that someone was killed in Iowa. Where else are people being killed? Where else are people dying? Where is this happening? Right? All these people did was go and join a demonstration around an issue that everybody recognizes is completely justified. Everyone recognizes that George Floyd should not have been murdered. Everybody recognizes that racism and police brutality are a big problem in the United States. So people that did what everyone basically, bonapartism, what everyone basically recognizes is the right thing, their lives were taken from them. Their lives were ruthlessly snuffed out, in some cases by right-wingers who didn't agree with them, in some cases by police officers. People died for protesting, for exercising their freedom of assembly and their freedom of speech. They were killed. And the mainstream media doesn't even want to make this a scandal. The U.S. mainstream media doesn't even want to make this a scandal. They have decided it's not important. I am going to try. Someone says I should do it, and I'm trying to keep track of how many people have died in the past few months at these protests. I'm going to keeping track of this, and I'm going to keep highlighting this, because they shouldn't be able to get away with this. They shouldn't be able to say, oh, in China, no one's allowed to protest or they're killed. Well, there's protests all the time, and we don't talk about that. Oh, in Russia, you can't protest or you get killed. Actually, there's protests all the time, but we don't talk about that. But in the United States, look at all the freedom. And people are dying on the streets. People are dying on American streets. And U.S. mainstream media has decided that, well, yeah, we'll mention it in passing, but we're not going to dwell on it. No, people are dying. And you can bet that if people on the right wing were dying, Fox News would milk it for all it was worth. Fox News would say, oh my God, they were killed by the socialist government and Barack Obama is But the left, these people are protesting against racism. They're protesting against police brutality. They're protesting around the issue of Black Lives Matter. And MSNBC and CNN have decided, oh, we don't talk about that. We don't go there. We don't talk about it. It's amazing. It's shocking. And it reveals the hypocrisy. It reveals the utter hypocrisy of what's taking place right now. So please keep your eye on this. If you see a case around the country, sometimes it's only the local news that even bothers to cover it. Send it my way. Tweet it at me. I am going to try to compile a body count of how many people have died, how many people's lives were taken away from them, how many people were summarily executed for protesting. Okay? I'm trying to keep track of it. I'm trying to keep track of it. If you find cases that are being buried by the mainstream but are happening in local news, send them my way. I am going to try and keep account of how many people died at these protests. How many people have died? Because no one who wants to talk about it. Mainstream media is just glossing over it like it didn't happen. And I want to keep track of it. So I hope I've made that point thoroughly. And on that note, I just wanted to talk a little bit about protesting and protesters. The first time I ever went to a protest was in Ohio. It was not even in my little town. It was a few towns over in a college town called Worcester, Ohio, where the College of Worcester, a small, I think Presbyterian college, is located. And there was a Quaker meeting in that town. And around the time, 2002, 2003, when there was talk of invading Iraq, there would be little tiny 5 or 6 or 7 people would have like a peace vigil in the town square. And I would go to the peace vigils myself. And they were very small, and that was the first time I ever protested anything. But it's interesting because having been born, in the 1980s, in the aftermath of the 1960s and 70s, knowledge of protesters and the role that protesters play was a big part of the culture. For example, one of the most popular movies when I was a kid was a movie called Forrest Gump. Have people ever seen Forrest Gump? It's a dumb movie starring Tom Hanks. But the character, Forrest Gump, is this mentally disabled man who fights in Vietnam and then becomes a Vietnam protester and then, starts a shrimp company and then invests in Apple. And it's a silly movie. It's like a through the decades movie about this mentally disabled Southern guy who lives through the cultural changes of post-war America from the 50s to the 80s. It's a dumb movie, but if you watch it, protesters are a pretty big part of that movie. And they portray the protesters as being disrespectful and foul-mouthed, and they're no good. But the Vietnam War is also portrayed in a negative light. It's kind of a dumb movie. But I grew up in my little town hearing a lot of stories about Jane Fonda. Jane Fonda was this actress from the 1970s who became a communist, basically. Jane Fonda was an actress, and, they'd always used to joke, oh, the vets ain't Fonda Jane. This idea was that Jane Fonda, because she had protested the Vietnam War, was a traitor to the country. And it was this understanding, and I heard these stories about Jane Fonda that were not actually true. One of the stories everyone knew about Jane Fonda is that Jane Fonda had gone to Vietnam, which she did. She went to Vietnam, and that U.S. prisoners of war in Vietnam, U.S. soldiers who were being held prisoner, gave her notes to give to their families, and that she then turned those notes over to the Vietnamese government officials who shot them for giving her the notes. Well, that's not actually true. What happened is that she did visit American prisoners of war in Vietnam. They did give her notes, and she delivered those notes to their families. She made a point, when U.S. prisoners of war gave her these notes, she made a point of giving them to the families. It was the exact opposite. She didn't get them killed for giving notes. She delivered the notes to the families, made a point of visiting the families and saying, your relative who's being held prisoner in Vietnam is okay, they're safe, they're not being tortured, and here's the note. And she delivered the note. So that was just a lie. But I heard that about Jane Fonda, right? And that Jane Fonda Jane Fonda was awful. And it fit in with this whole narrative. And I lived near Kent State University when I was a kid. I mentioned that there was the massacre there. And I would always hear these people say that, they should have shot more of those students. They were disrespecting America by protesting. And I'd always hear this other anecdote about how Vietnam War protesters spit on our troops when they came back to the country. They spit on the soldiers, right? And later I learned that that's a largely a manufactured story. It was in the movie Rambo. Rambo at one point, Sylvester Stallone is saying, they spit on me when I came back from Vietnam. And that, that military soldiers, when they flew in from Vietnam, they didn't fly to civilian airports. They flew to military airports. So the protests were not happening on military bases, right? That wasn't happening. So the story just doesn't add up. Were there people who were disrespectful of soldiers and told them they shouldn't do what they did and such? Perhaps. But the big story with Jane Fonda is that Jane Fonda actually made a point of going around the world to U.S. military bases and performing a performance. Like she did, it was kind of a circus performance that she did, around the country. It was called the FTA show. And she had rock bands, and she had different musical acts and performers, and it was called FTA stood for F the Army. And she was encouraging U.S. GIs to defect from the U.S. military. That's what she did, and actually there were she made a point of meeting, going to the areas where, in like the Philippines and Okinawa and Germany and places like that. And Jane Fonda actually made a point of meeting this famous movie star, meeting American GIs, being friendly to them and urging them to refuse to fight in the Vietnam War, that happened. And that's one of the most untold stories about the Vietnam War. It's not that the anti-war movement spit on soldiers. It's not the anti-war movement, said nasty things to soldiers, but the opposite. The anti-war movement recruited a lot of soldiers. A lot of soldiers joined the anti-war movement. One of those soldiers was John Kerry, right? Former Secretary of State of the United States. John Kerry, he was in Vietnam. He fought in the Vietnam War. He quit the Army, came back, and he founded VVAW, Vietnam Veterans Against the War. And John Kerry even testified before Congress about how awful the war was. He convened something called the Winter Soldier Tribunals, where Vietnam vets talked about the awful things they did in Vietnam, the atrocities they committed. The anti-war movement didn't spit on soldiers. It recruited them. There was also something called the American Servicemen's Union. That was, was headed by a soldier named Andy Stapp, who I had the opportunity of meeting on several occasions. And I attended his memorial. He was a member of the Workers' World Party at the time I was a member. He died when I was in the Workers' World Party. And Andy Stapp, he was a soldier, and no, he didn't go around spitting on soldiers. He recruited other soldiers to join the ASU, the American Servicemen's Union. So that narrative of the anti-war hippies were just going around spitting on our troops, and that's why you should never protest a war again. I heard that my entire childhood. I saw it on TV, on Forrest Gump, and in so many movies. It's not true. It's simply not true. The anti-war movement recruited soldiers overwhelmingly, so that's just not an accurate narrative. But that's part of how I grew up hearing about protesters. And largely the attitude that people in my little area had, and people, even when I was in college close to Cleveland, the attitude that people had was that people who protest are mentally ill, right? That was the attitude, right? And it's interesting because I live in New York City now, and that's not the attitude at all. In New York City, the feeling is that protesting is a thing people do. The teachers' unions regularly have protests around teachers' issues. Students go to support their teachers at those protests. Teachers, go and protest, and that it's largely considered to be acceptable to protest in New York City. The Democratic Party, the labor unions in the city, the NAACP, the ACLU, Planned Parenthood, even among normal, average New Yorkers, going to a few protests is pretty typical. It's pretty normal. But in the area I grew up in, there was a feeling that all protests were violent, all protests were illegal, and the only people who did them were psychologically deranged people. That was the attitude. It was very, very interesting, the attitude. I remember when I was in high school, I had an argument with somebody at my school. It was about Fred Phelps. Do folks remember Fred Phelps? Well, Fred Phelps was this right-wing pastor who went around with signs, God hates FAGS, right? And he would go, when a gay person would die, he would protest their funeral with nasty signs. Fred Phelps. And he was this minister, right? And he was protesting gay people's funerals. And that wasn't getting him enough publicity, so he was protesting the funerals of U.S. troops who died, saying that they died in Iraq as God punishing America for homosexuality. Not a nice guy. So I remember when I was in high school having to explain to some of my classmates that Mr. Fred Phelps was not a hippie, that Mr. Fred Phelps was not a leftist. And they said that Fred Phelps, he's a protester, kind of like you, Caleb, he's a protester. I said, no, he's right-wing. Fred Phelps is a right-winger. They said, but right-wing people don't protest. Protesters are left-wing, and they hate America, and they spit on our troops. And Fred Phelps hates America, and he's spitting on... I said, but he's right-wing. Fred Phelps is a conservative. He's protesting against homosexuality. He's an evangelical. And they didn't get it. And I remember having that argument and explaining to people that not all protesters are leftists. And that was something people didn't get at that time. The people in my town were under the impression that protesters in general were left-wing and they hated soldiers. And that's why, and that's what I was told. And I was even called to the principal's office and yelled at, during the Iraq War, because there was this feeling that because during the Vietnam War, the protesters had disrespected the country, you should never, ever, ever protest against a war ever again. And I was told this by my teachers. I was told this by the principal in the principal's office. During the Vietnam War, the protesters had disrespected the country. So because of that, we should never protest a war ever again. That's what I was told. And it was this narrative. And it started really with the Gulf War in 91, when they put up the 92, when they put up the yellow ribbons and support our troops. And it was like this narrative that got sent out in the 80s and 90s that the anti-Vietnam War movement had been too extreme and too radical, so therefore you should never protest anything ever again because you're disrespecting the country. That's kind of the narrative of that a lot of right-wing people had, but it's changing. I understand that even in my little tiny town in Ohio, there was a very small Black Lives Matter demonstration in my little town, right? And that it's so trendy now. Protesting, the attitude toward it is changing. I also remember, what I remember is that, when I was in college, they had a college Republicans club at my college. They had college Democrats, college Republicans, and that I saw on the bus one time a woman who I knew was a leader of the college Republicans. I got onto the bus, and Haiti autocratic government decreed critical codes 15-year-old reduced alcohol. All right, we'll talk about Haiti. All right, thanks. We'll talk about Haiti. But yeah, I remember, getting on the bus, and there was the woman who'd been the president of the college Republicans, and she knew me because I was politically outspoken on the campus. So I remember saying to her, "Oh, are you still with the college Republicans?" She said, "No." And she said, "Why not?" And she said, "I'm not a protester." And she'd explained to me that once the Republicans, around the time Obama got elected, started doing the Tea Parties, she was just not comfortable with that because she had this attitude that protesting, people who protest are mentally ill and crazy. Protests are scary, they're illegal. And when it became the Republican thing to do to go out and protest, she'd quit being a Republican. I thought that was kind of amusing. And that, yeah, the Tea Party seemed to be the first time we saw right-wing people like protesting, right? It was like mobilizing their supporters to go out and protest. And that until the Obama election, right, the atmosphere among most of the right wing was that you just don't do that. Now, there were anti-abortion vigils. You would see anti-abortion vigils. They would gather with the image of the mutilated fetus and the cross, and they'd be talking about that. So you would see anti-abortion protesters. So that was right wing. So that was kind of the exception. Other than the anti-abortion protesters, you didn't really see right-wing protesters. But, however, around the time of Obama's election, suddenly the Tea Party was protesting and there were right-wing protesters. And a lot of Republicans were deeply uncomfortable with that because they just had been trained with this narrative that protesting is not okay. It's a bad thing to do. The other thing that's amusing about protests is I do remember when I was in college, at the time the Iraq War was a big issue, and I remember saying to a number of the people I was in class with, hey, there's going to be a protest downtown against the Iraq War, why don't you come? And they were against the Iraq War. Most of the people at my college were more or less opposed to the invasion of Iraq, and I would say, or the continued occupation. And I'd invite them to go to anti-war protests, and they would get this scared look on their face. I can't protest. I'm not a protester. And I'd be like, why? Oh, I can't protest. And it was this, they were terrified of protesting, right? Because of this widely prevailing notion that if you protest, you are insane. It was just this scary idea. To come to a demonstration was scary to a lot of these younger people. The notion of protesting was just, I can't protest. And a lot of the left-wing people knew the war was wrong, but the idea of going to a protest made them afraid, all right? Because their parents might disagree, other people might disagree, they just aren't willing to go out and protest. And that always perplexed me. I remember explaining to people, and people would say, I don't protest. I don't think that marching around with signs, does any good. And I would explain to people, I would say, you know who Dr. Martin Luther King was? Of course I know who he is. He has a national holiday. What do you think he did? And I would point out to people that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who is at this point an canonized national hero, was a protester. And that was like something that had never occurred to people before. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a protester. And I'd be like, yes, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a protester. And they'd be like, but he's good. I'd be like, yep. But he's a hero. I'd be like, yep. But it was like it never occurred to these people that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., somebody that is widely respected, someone who's not insane, someone who's not, criminal, someone who's not violent, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a protester. It never occurred to these people. But if you pointed it out to them, they would go, huh, wow. But it showed. Again, the culture has very much shifted. In New York City, again, protesting is considered something that people do. People do it occasionally. But in Ohio, there was this attitude that only crazy and deranged extremist people do it. But now that's changing because now Republicans are doing it. But it's all kind of up in the air and it's all changing. I'll never forget, New York City is a little bit of a different political atmosphere than Ohio, where I grew up. And one of the things that amused me about protests in New York City was that, the people who shout, who don't agree with protesters, they say different things, right? In Ohio, if you were protesting against the Iraq War and someone walked by who didn't like it, they'd say, you're a terrorist. Why don't you move to another country? Something like that. Well, in New York City, their reply was very, very different. And I'll never forget this, because this was one of the stupidest moments of New York City protesting I ever witnessed, of New York City counter-protesting, I should say. I was at a rally for healthcare, right? The Transit Workers Union of New York City, the TWU, was having a protest around the issue of healthcare. It was outside of the presidential debate that was happening, I think a presidential debate or a presidential forum. And there was a crowd of like thousands of people organized by the Transit Workers Union protesting around like they wanted a better healthcare plan from the Democrats, like single payer now. So single payer now was their protest demand. Big crowd of them out there. And these right-wing people are walking by and they shout at a crowd of transit workers in their uniforms, no less. They're in their uniforms. All their signs say TWU, Transit Workers Union, on them. And they shout at them, quote, "Get a job." I kid you not. Get a job. They're transit workers. It's a union demonstration. But that's, and I didn't even understand that one, right? Because, when I was in Ohio, people did not shout, "Get a job" at us, right? People did not shout, "Get a job." They shouted, "You're un-American, you're unpatriotic, move to another country, you're a terrorist." Never did people say, "Get a job," because it was assumed that, that we had a job or we wanted a job, right? I mean, it was like, but it's a class difference. See, New York City, the attitude toward protesters is a little bit different. There's this attitude that if you're protesting, you must be a lazy person who doesn't want to work, right? And they're thinking about the 60s and like people who lived in Central Park and did drugs all day. And they're thinking about hippies, right? And so I always was like, I remember turning to my other protesters, what do they mean, get a job? Like, what's the idea? Right? Because it's like, I mean, I didn't even understand it, but it was like some kind of anti-hippie taunt from like 2 decades ago. But that's what that was about. So, but, and they shouted it at transit workers. So it wasn't really a well thought out insult. I mean, the right wing has never really impressed me in the United States with their intellectual abilities. But yeah, I mean, the attitude toward protesters has definitely changed. I mean, the fact that in my little town in Ohio, people are protesting around Black Lives Matter, I mean, that's big. The fact that there's right-wing protests all the time. There did not used to be right-wing protests in the United States. It used to be the right wing was against protesters, period. But that has changed. We have right-wing and left-wing protests all the time. Now in the United States, we have big protests, and people have died in these protests in the last few months. So I'm just reflecting on the nature of protesters and protests in general. For many years, when I was an activist, that was almost all I did, was just protest. That was like my main focus of activity, organizing protests, going to protests, and I was in that milieu. And one thing I will say, I'm very positive on protesting. One thing I will say, though, is one of the problems with being a protester, somebody who just, you go to work and then afterwards you go protest. That's what I used to do. I worked at the insurance company. Every day after work, I was at Occupy Wall Street. And one of the problems with doing that is that you get into a bubble. You get into a bubble where you stop really thinking about how the rest of the world and how the rest of the country sees you. And it's almost like you're just trying to impress other protesters. And that can become a problem. And I think that in a lot of ways, like, for example, when I was a protester, I was a big advocate of what you might call Antifa kind of stuff, right? I would say, they won't give us our freedom, we shouldn't give them theirs, kick the ass of the right wing, the only good Nazi is the dead one. I would say stuff like this. I believed it. And the reason I believed it was because I was surrounded by other left-wing protesters, and I thought it sounded badass. I thought I wanted to sound like the tough guy. I don't believe in their free speech. But then, I stopped going to protests. I started working in media and such, and I realized what Antifa does. That Antifa essentially does 2 things. Number 1, it makes the right-wingers look like victims. Number 2, it offers no counter-argument, right? So on the one hand, the right wing, they get to be the center of attention because, Antifa is just anti, and they're wearing black masks, and they have no signs. So the right-wingers become the center of attention, and they say, look, I'm just trying to be right-wing, and these people are beating me up. Oh, it's awful. Number 1. Number two, right, there's no counter-argument. So they get to be the center of attention because people are beating them up, and they get to look like victims, and there's no counter-argument to their ideas. So basically, Antifa helps these people get publicity, right? I mean, and on top of that, in some cases, Antifa attacks the media, They'll attack the media because they don't want to be filmed doing the violent stuff they do. So I'm at the point where I don't approve of Antifa. I think Antifa is actually helping. Antifa has nothing to do with the Black Lives Matter protests. And the right wing has created this hysteria about Antifa. You know, I mean, and the right-wing narrative about Antifa is pretty stupid also, right? Because the right wing has created this narrative where, you know, grandma, elderly woman is, going to the grocery store, filling, paid for her groceries. She's out putting her groceries in the car, and all of a sudden these men in black masks show up. Grandma, is that a Trump bumper sticker on your car? And she's like, I'm sorry, Antifa, I don't want any trouble. Please don't beat me up. No, we are Antifa. We shall beat the living sense out of random conservative woman. Yeah, that's what, like, Fox News would have you believe Antifa is. It's not that, okay? It's definitely not that, right? Antifa, they're going after actual Nazis. They're going after actual white supremacists. I don't agree with their tactic, though. I'll just tell you. It makes them look like victims, number one. It makes them look like victims. It makes the right wing the center of attention, and their arguments never get answered. Plus, let me add this. The Antifa logic is now being used to shut down the left. How many times have you seen Max Blumenthal accused of being a Nazi? How many times have you seen me accused of being a Nazi, right? That it's kind of serving the liberal order right now. So I just don't approve of the Antifa stuff. But at the same time, they don't care what I think. Antifa is not calling me up and saying, hey, Caleb, should we go and fist fight? They're not asking me. So, but I'm at the point where, because I'm not in the protest cage any longer, right? When I was in the protest cage, I just wanted to impress the other people in the protest cage, and my views were limited because I lived in a bubble. I didn't understand how the wider society was seeing things. And that can be a bit of a problem. And that is my biggest criticism of some of the leftist groups, is they don't really want to reach the wider society. They've kind of given up on most Americans, on average Americans. They assume that average Americans can never be convinced of socialism. They just want to appear the most badass and the most cool and badass to other leftists. And because of that, millions of Americans who would become socialists right now have never heard a socialist argument, and they think the left would look crazy, right? Because if that's what you're doing, if your game is to look more badass to other protesters, you're just going to start acting and doing things that are look even more and more and more crazy to average Americans. So, there you go. And so I'll give you that. But yeah. So, but overall, the attitude toward protesters is changing in this country. You look at images of the protests from the 1930s that the Communist Party USA organized during the Great Depression. You look at the huge black nationalist mobilizations that Marcus Garvey, that he mobilized during the 1920s and 30s. You look at events like the Million Man March that Minister Farrakhan organized. Protests are a big part of American culture. So I just wanted to kind of reflect on that for my opening remarks. So, before we jump into names and locations and all of that, I did want to say, don't super chat me about Rotten Quesadilla. This Rotten Quesadilla guy, whatever, spoiled burrito, whatever his name is, don't ask me about that. And don't ask me about Dugan either. I've addressed that about 50 times. The whole speech is online, so don't ask me about it. And if you super chat me about it, I'm not going to answer you about that. I'm tired of addressing this. And let me say this. I know there's people listening right now who are new or whatever. And many people say to me, Caleb, if you just address this Dugan thing, everyone will understand it. I have addressed it 100 times. And people still come at me with the same questions. It doesn't matter. The people that are bringing this up are not bringing this up because they have serious questions. This is a smear campaign. It's how dare you associate with Russia? How dare you talk to people with whom we disagree? And at this point, they're being blatantly dishonest. For example, there's a video of me on here talking about how the slogan open borders is not strategic for the left. That video, it's like my last video. You can watch it on the YouTube channel. On that video, I make it overwhelmingly clear that I am in favor of full legalization for all immigrants. I'm opposed to anti-immigrant crackdowns. It's like so obvious, but these people are tweeting out that I'm an anti-immigrant bigot and that I advocate some kind of war against immigrants, because they're liars and they're intentionally lying. They're intentionally lying, right? And they don't even have solid beliefs of their own. They sit there, and everything I say, they sit there, how can we twist this around and make it a fascist thing? How can we twist this around and make it a fascist thing? And they say wild things like that I advocate social Darwinism, which is ridiculous. They attack me because I wear a suit. Oh my God, Tomas Sankara. Definitely talk about that. Tomas Sankara and African leaders. So these people are liars, and they're intentionally lying. But their main aim, and this is why I'm not going to answer any super chats about the rotten quesadilla, is because their main aim is to try and affect what we're doing here, right? They want one of two things to happen. They want me to, start thinking before I say anything. Oh boy, I better not say that. I mean, rotten quesadilla will twist it all around, and they want me to be nervous to say certain things or to emphasize certain points because it'll out of fear of what they'll say, or they want me to devote all my time to trying to refute their spurious claims that they don't even believe. So or maybe they want me to double down and be really extreme about whatever they criticize, right? They're trying to have an impact on our conversation here. I don't want that to happen. I want to be real with you, tell you what's on my mind, tell you what needs to be said, tell you what I want to tell you, give you a straight up analysis. I don't want them to have an impact on our conversation. I don't want them to have an impact on our conversation here. So I'm urging you to just not let them have an impact on our conversation, because that's what they're trying to do. They want to have an impact on what we talk about here every time I get on here. They want to influence it one way or another. They maybe want to see how they can influence it. Let's not let them have an influence, right? It's obvious right now that these are not leftists with legitimate concerns. It's not that, and it's not even honest people. They're intentionally lying. They watch a video where I go to great lengths to make clear I am not opposed to immigrant rights. I just don't think the open borders slogan is good. And they twist that into saying that I support Trump's wall, right? Gaddafi's accomplishments, okay. So they twist that around to saying that they're lying, right? And they're intentionally lying. And that's all there is to it. So when people are proving themselves to be that honest, that dishonest, at that point you have to realize that this is something else. It's something else. Thank you, David. So when people are being that dishonest, there's something else going on here. So it's not worth my time. So don't ask me about Dugin. And don't tell me that if I just address it, it'll go away, because I have addressed it over and over and over and over and over again. I have answered, you don't know how many times people have super chatted me about Dugin. I have given the exact same answer every time, and it doesn't go away because it's not a legitimate question. It's a gotcha, right? And the hilarious thing is these people never heard of Dugin, right? These people never heard of Dugin. They know nothing about Dugin's work. They just know they're supposed to hate him. And so, therefore, you're supposed to hate me because I sat down and talked to him. Well, I sat down and talked to Augustus Sol Invictus. I sat down and talked to Donald Trump. I will sit down and talk with people many times, And Russia is an anti-imperialist country. And Dugin is a conservative. He has his own views, and that's fine. But he's anti-imperialist. And I recommend people check out his book, The Fourth Political Theory. It's a good book. I don't agree with a lot of it. I agree with a lot of it, though. And it's a good analysis of politics in our time and what's going on. He's a conservative. I'm a leftist. He does not believe in historical progress. He's a traditionalist and an orthodox conservative nationalist in Russia. I'm a leftist. So I don't agree with his worldview. But his analysis of, what the left is, Western liberalism, the role that fascism historically played, the role that communism historically played, what's going on now with the fourth political theory. It's interesting. So check it out, read what he actually says, and make your own decision about it. Don't ask me. I'm not a Duginist, and Dugin has his views and I have mine. So it's not worth addressing. The people who bring it up are bringing it up to be dishonest, and they're bringing it up to smear me. So don't ask me about it. That's all there is to it. So on that note, I'm going to pour myself a little bit more orange juice. and I will shout out your names and locations, and then we'll get to the super chats. All righty. Names and locations, folks. North of Detroit, Dallas, Texas, Montreal, Quebec, Germany, Cincinnati, Ohio, Jenny Lynn, Long Island, New York, Los Angeles, Sam Levin, Kevin Q in Ohio, Sydney, Australia, Newark, New Jersey, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Belarus, Connecticut, Brisbane, Australia, Columbus, Ohio, Orange City, Iowa, Donnie Wallace Newton in Grove City, North Carolina, Minsk, Belarus, Wilmington, California, Culver City, Nashville, Tennessee, Las Vegas, Michael in Ithaca, Virginia, Logan, Utah, Jasper, Texas, Minnesota, Independence, Missouri, Rachel Martinez, Jack Dundee in the United Kingdom, David in Italy, Lisbon, Portugal, Napoleon, Canada, Bendigo, Australia, David Fox, Buffalo, New York, Brian Janakowski, Anthony Penza in Cleveland, Lynchburg, Tennessee, Berlin, Deutschland, right? Ertiaro, Fresno, California, Chengdu, China, Austin, Texas, Lethbridge, Alberta, Canada, Pomona, California, Baltimore, Lynchburg, Greenland, Georgia, Shannon, Georgia, A. Clark in Michigan, Ali from Oman, Jay in Jackson, Florida again, the Kremlin, Marissa in Buffalo, New York, Washington State, Rocky from Reno, Nevada, Calvin from Saskatoon, Original, Pyongyang, North Korea, Nate in Sydney, Australia, Dan from Iran, Dan from Pittsburgh, Based, Time Traveler from the USSR, Will DeMarco, Pennsylvania, USA, West Virginia, No War But Class War. Greetings from Sydney, Australia. A lot of Australian fans out there. I must be popular out there. Las Vegas, Itzel, Gatsia, Iran. Big shout out to Langley. Ha ha ha, says Oz Whistles. Germany. Alrighty. Someone trying to do a Bart Simpson joke. Perth, Washington. Northern California, Australia, Springfield, Missouri, Zach Campbell. It's a great crowd who's here with us today. I have deep affection for all of you. Western Australia. Alrighty. Well, if you haven't done so already, Chester County, Pennsylvania, Dallas, Texas, Isaiah. Shout out to you, Isaiah Madrigal. If you haven't done so already, now would be a good time to hit the like button, to hit the subscribe button, to hit the notifications bell, to tweet this out, make it a bigger conversation, put this on your Facebook, put this on your Twitter, put this on Reddit. The more people here, the more fun we have. The bigger this community gets, the more fun we have. A great night for all of us. All right. I'm going to start jumping into these super chats. If you've got more super chats, I will put them on the list. So let's talk about these super chats. Kinky was the first one, and she asked about Epstein, Israel, and Dershowitz. Now, many people have raised the question that Epstein, it seemed like his pedophile island where men would go and have sex with underage girls. It seems that the intent was to blackmail people, that there were cameras all over it, and the intent was something to do with blackmail, and that was the intent. It was to use dirt on people. And many people have raised the question is it possible that he was doing this for Israeli intelligence? Epstein was very much tied in with Israel, a very pro-Israel individual. And was it possible that what he was doing was some kind of Israeli intelligence operation? That this was the way that Israel dealt with its opponents, and that seems to be a question that's kind of off limits for mainstream media. I don't have the answer to that, obviously, and I haven't done the huge amount of research that would be necessary to give a full answer. Now, one person who has done a great amount of research into it is Whitney Webb, who's a journalist with Mint Press News. So look into Whitney Webb's work. She's the person I would recommend the most regarding all the research. She has done the research. Nobody has researched the Epstein case more than Whitney Webb. She has really dug into it. So check out her work. She's gone on with George Galloway before. She's written a lot of articles about it. I would check out Whitney Webb as kind of the person who follows that case and has the most information about it. And we know about the recent arrest that took place, Now, as far as Alan Dershowitz, Alan Dershowitz is an interesting character. He's kind of a liberal law professor. He's like probably the most famous lawyer and law professor in the country. He worked with the O.J. Simpson case, and Alan Dershowitz is very, very pro-Israel, an extreme supporter of Israel, just a pro-Israeli extremist, and he is known for going after people that are critical of Israel. He has a debate with Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky isn't even anti-Israel. He's just critical of it. Noam Chomsky opposes boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Watch the debate between Alan Dershowitz and Noam Chomsky. It gets particularly ugly. He gets particularly ugly and nasty. Watch Dershowitz engage with Norman Finkelstein. Norman Finkelstein and Dershowitz, it gets particularly nasty. Dershowitz is very, very pro-Israel. One thing I will give Dershowitz credit for is that because of the fact that he's a lawyer and that he's working with people who want to become defense attorneys, he is one of the most brazen critics of the legal system in the United States. And because of his credibility, he can get away with saying stuff about the U.S. legal system that other people are afraid to say. Like, one of the things Alan Dershowitz talks a lot about is police perjury. Alan Dershowitz has been very outspoken about the fact that police get up and lie on the stand all the time. The police officers in the United States, when they testify, they lie. And they don't get prosecuted because they're lying to help prosecutors. So prosecutors don't prosecute them for perjury. He talks about that. Another thing that he talks about is the selective prosecution around the issue of sex workers and prostitution in New York State. I forget which politician it was. There was one politician in New York State. They started prosecuting him for his involvement with prostitutes. And Dershowitz came forward and said, "Are you kidding me? Do you know how much of that goes on in New York City?" It was really clearly a selective prosecution. Occasionally Alan Dershowitz will say interesting things about the legal system. But Alan Dershowitz, I understand he has ties to Mr. Epstein. And the other thing about Alan Dershowitz is the ruthlessness of his pro-Israeli position is pretty extreme. He's extremely pro-Israel, to the point of accusing anyone who doesn't agree with Israel of being anti-American and being a terrorist and such. And I believe what's his name? Norman Finkelstein wrote a book kind of refuting one of the pro-Israeli books that Alan Dershowitz wrote, and showing that not only did Norman Finkelstein critique the book, but he pointed out that the book was actually, in many ways plagiarized from an earlier book. There you go. Now, folks are, I don't want to say too much. If you want to ask about the Epstein case, I would encourage you to check out Whitney Webb's work. She's done a huge amount of research on the case. All right, did Gorbachev want to destroy the USSR? Well, not exactly. That's a good question. It's pretty clear that the Soviet Union needed reform. It needed to change, right? That there were a lot of big problems in the Soviet Union. And, Gorbachev, he was trying to resolve those problems, but that he had been very much taken in by the United States. And people who went to the Soviet Union during that time told me that this was a big problem, and that the people in the higher levels of the Soviet Communist Party were convinced that America was not so bad. And it was a long kind of psychological warfare campaign that the U.S. government waged, trying to convince leaders of the Soviet Communist Party that the USA didn't really mind them so much. And that Gorbachev was really convinced that the Soviet Union the USA was their friend. The USA was their ally. The USA didn't mean them any harm. And that if they would just, have some quote unquote democratic reforms, the USA would get off their back. And that Gorbachev was taken in, and that there was a whole effort to try and patronize the Soviet bureaucracy and win over sections of the Soviet bureaucracy. There was a friend of mine, an old friend of mine, who had worked at a summer camp in the Soviet Union. She was she spoke Russian, and she was hired to be like a camp counselor in the Soviet Union. And she was a communist, and I remember her telling me that in the Soviet Union, many of the high-ranking communist folks believed that the United States really did have all the freedom that it claimed to have. And she would tell them about Fred Hampton and how he was executed for being a leader of the Black Panthers. He was murdered. And they would say things like, yeah, but he must have done something, that the U.S. government wanted to kill him that bad. He must have been bad. And there was a show called, that was very similar to Cops, right? It was modeled on the show Cops that was on American television. In the final years of the Soviet Union, there was a show that was a lot like Cops. It was a lot like, it was like cameras following police around. And that the Soviet culture was largely changing. And that, Gorbachev and a lot of Gorbachev, he thought Ronald Reagan was a great guy. He thought Margaret Thatcher was a great woman. And they were taken in by this belief that the U.S. government wasn't so bad, and that NATO wouldn't expand, and that if they would just throw in the towel and dissolve the Soviet Union, their economy would be respected, their territory would be respected, and it would just be kind of a peaceful end to the Cold War. And a lot of the Soviet Communist Party believed that, and was kind of taken in and was kind of, duped by that. And they didn't quite understand that they were setting the stage for a huge disaster, right? The fall of the Soviet Union was a humanitarian catastrophe. Millions of people died. Mass unemployment, mass hunger, mass poverty, drug addiction everywhere, sex trafficking through the roof, suicide through the roof. The fall of the Soviet Union was a humanitarian disaster. Something like 80% of the farms in Russia went out of business, so they had to start importing all their food from the United States. That was one of the problems that occurred. The factories closed their doors. It was just devastating. The fall of the Soviet Union was a humanitarian crisis. And I know that we've all been told in the United States that it was just this big party of everyone jumping around saying that they were free. But no, the fall of the Soviet Union, in terms of economy, in terms of GDP, in terms of living standards, in terms of poverty rates, it was a huge, huge, huge disaster. It was just a disaster. It was a disaster in every possible way. The fall of the Soviet Union was a disaster. And that doesn't fit with the narrative of what you're supposed to believe in this country, but that's the case. And, it was a section of the Soviet leadership, the moderate wing of the Soviet Communist Party, the moderates, really had been taken in and had been convinced that the USA wasn't so bad and they'd be able to privatize and move toward and dismantle socialism and everything would be fine. Now, the hardliners in the Communist Party didn't think that. There was the quote-unquote coup where, Gorbachev was arrested, and the whole thing was a disaster. But yeah, I don't think Gorbachev intended to destroy the USSR. I think he was convinced that they could make nice with the United States and just transition, and that was a mistake. There you go. Alrighty. All right, somebody asked me about Hezbollah. That's a group in Lebanon. They're very anti-imperialist. They think that, the U.S. imperialists are the main enemy. They're terror. They're designated by the U.S. government as a legally designated terrorist organization. Should U.S. November election have international observers? That's a good question. So Hezbollah, but Hezbollah, from what I understand, has great admiration for Che Guevara and for Hugo Chavez. There's statements they put out that are very critical of capitalism. They're from the Shia Islamic tradition. Hezbollah was actually a merger of a number of groups in Lebanon. When Lebanon faced an Israeli invasion, there were a number of self-defense groups, like militias, that were formed to fight Israel. And Hezbollah was kind of a merger of different groups. And they had wild names. Look at the names of some of these groups that merged into Hezbollah. One of them was called like the Organization of the Oppressed People on Earth. Imagine, what kind of name is that? The Organization of the Oppressed People on Earth. And you know, they had wild names, but they all merged into one group, which is Hezbollah, which is very powerful in Lebanon. The leader is Nasrallah. And you know, I mean, they're very popular. And they have Christian members. They're not only Muslims. The Communist Party of Lebanon is aligned with them, from what I understand. And Lebanese politics is very divided. You have the communists, you have the Hezbollah, you also have, at the same time, you have Christians and Maronites and pro-Israeli folks in Lebanon. Lebanon's very complicated, right? You know, it's divided up by religion, you know, and you know, the French, when they colonized Lebanon, they divided everyone by religion. They have the different confessions of Lebanon. They have Shia areas, they have Catholic areas, they have, you know, Baptist, Lutheran. I mean, it's you know, Alawite, Druze, right? It's very complicated. It's a small country, but a lot of, you know, its political system is very complex because there are so many different ethnic and religious groups there. Alrighty. Bundism. What about Bundism? Well, Bundism was a trend among Jews who argued that Jews should have a separate communist party. That because Jews were a group that faced a specific kind of discrimination, that they should have a separate communist group of their own. Lenin opposed Bundism. He said that that was not correct, that you needed one party for the workers of each country. At the time the Black Panthers were strong, many of the communist groups accused the Black Panthers of being a Bundist party because it was, you know, essentially the idea of a black communist party. You know, and I mean, Lenin opposed Bundism, and he said that Bundism was not principled and was not correct. And Bundism, it's important to note, is separate from labor Zionism, right? So Bundism was the idea that Jews needed their own communist party. But there was another trend they called labor Zionism, and that was groups that wanted to move to Israel, but make Israel a socialist country. You know, and the labor Zionists and the Bundists both aligned with the Bolsheviks during the Civil War. So, I mean, it's a trend. You can read about it, Bundism. It's not really that big anymore. Just like labor Zionism. I mean, there's still somebody somewhere doing something. But yeah, in terms of a political trend, not many people are doing it anymore. But it was in Russia, there was a lot of discrimination against Jews. There was the pogroms and the massacres that would happen. So as a result of that, there was a feeling that Jews needed their own communist party. Lenin opposed them and urged the Bundists to merge into the Bolshevik party. So yeah, that's what Bundism is. It's interesting because you'll know that in Russia, Stalin eventually set up the JAR, the Jewish Autonomous Region, in the Soviet Union to give a national territory to Jews, which is interesting. And many people don't talk about that. But yes, that Stalin set up the JAR and did give a national territory within the USSR to Jews as their answer to Zionism, right? Because the USSR, until the Second World War was over, the USSR was strongly opposed to Zionism. So one of their arguments was Jews will have a national territory within the Soviet Union. And that was one of their answers to Zionism, was they've created the Jewish Autonomous Region, which I think is interesting. Alrighty. The U.S. role in the Korean War. What was the U.S. role in the Korean War? Well, you know, the northern part of the Korean Peninsula was liberated by Soviet troops. The southern part of the Korean Peninsula was liberated by U.S. troops. And the idea was that there would be peninsula-wide elections, you know, to elect a single new government. But in the South, they made it very clear, you know, in the South, there was a military coup by Syngman Rhee, who was a Japanese collaborator, who was a military leader in the South, and he became the, he became kind of the dictator. And they were not going to have elections in which the Communist Party, the Korean Workers' Party, which was a merger, which was like the ruling party in the North, would be allowed to participate. So then on Jeju Island, which was a stronghold in South Korea, it's an island in South Korea that was a stronghold of Communist, party members, Communist sympathies. The people of the island were protesting, and they were massacred. There was a brutal massacre at Jeju Island. And there's a very good documentary, Ghosts of Jeju, about it. But, you know, it was a horrific massacre at Jeju Island where thousands of people were slaughtered, just slaughtered because they were communist sympathizers, they were protesting for free elections, etc., and they were massacred. And so after that, North Korea tried to reunify the peninsula because not only were they going to bar free elections for the whole continent, but there was this brutal massacre happening against peaceful protesters in the South. So, in response to that, the North tried to reunify. It's so funny. They'll tell you in U.S. media, North Korea invaded South Korea. Well, there's one Korea, right? And they had just been divided. That doesn't work, right? That the USA was not, was basically enabling a military dictatorship in the South. That military dictatorship was slaughtering communists and Korean protesters and workers. So North Korea, the northern forces, with the support of China, were trying to reunify the Korean Peninsula. The United States got involved and carried out mass atrocities, mass bombing raids. In North Korea, every building above 1 story tall was bombed and destroyed. They bombed dikes and flooded areas. They would burn families alive in basements. They would trap. There'd be families, would be hiding in a basement. And so the U.S. troops would come and pour gasoline, through the window, the basement opening, and pour into the cellar opening, and then just light it on fire and burn them alive in the basement. I mean, horrendous atrocities. It's interesting. There was a documentary made for BBC television called The Unknown War, about the Korean War. And they wouldn't show it on American television because they thought American audiences couldn't handle it. I think they may have shown an edited version of it eventually. But it was for BBC, and they thought American audiences wouldn't handle that. The amount of atrocities that were committed by the United States in the Korean War is massive. Massive. Huge atrocities. I mean, people, burned alive, every building destroyed. I mean, the military would come back and they'd say, there's nothing left for us to bomb. We have bombed every possible building we could bomb. They said, okay, bomb the dikes. And they'd bomb all the dikes and flood everywhere. Okay, what do we bomb now? I mean, it was horrendous. I mean, millions. Like, I've heard numbers like 2 to 4 million Koreans were killed in the Korean War. 2 to 4 million people were killed. It was a war that was like something we can't even imagine. That many people dying in mass. It was a horrendous war. And the United States even threatened to drop the atomic bomb on China. Little known fact is that, China was supporting North Korea. And there was the threat made. U.S. General Douglas MacArthur threatened to drop the atomic bomb on China, but he threatened this without asking the permission of the U.S. President Truman. So he was fired for that. It was just devastating and horrible. It was just awful. And millions of people died. However, North Korea, they remain the only country in the world to have ever captured a U.S. Army general. Right? They captured a U.S. Army general during that war. Mao Zedong, his son died. The son of the president of China, Mao, his son died on the Korean Peninsula. Mao Anyang died fighting against the United States on the Korean Peninsula. Millions of Chinese people went and fought the United States on the Korean Peninsula. It was a massive, ugly war. And it was really the first big defeat the United States had ever experienced. I mean, technically it was a stalemate. They just drew the line at the 38th parallel. They had an armistice. They never signed a peace treaty. But the United States, the United States had the atomic bomb at that point. And the Soviets, I think, didn't even have it yet, or maybe had just gotten it. And the Soviets were not involved. It was mainly China. I mean, the Soviets were kind of supporting North Korea, but not fully. It was careful. But regardless, the United States was defeated and driven back to the 38th parallel. It was huge. And then later, the students in South Korea rose up and toppled Syngman Rhee, the military dictator. Syngman Rhee, the students across South Korea, the April Revolution occurred, where the students rose up and toppled the dictator. And that happened. And the students, after the war, the students rose up against the dictatorship. And then, later you had the rise of Park Chung-hee, who was a dictator who did a lot to develop the economy and try and stabilize South Korea. And that's why South Korea's economy is strong, is because the United States and Japan worked to stabilize South Korea as a barrier against communism. But yeah, I mean, the students of South Korea, and that there is a strong left in South Korea. It's illegal. South Korea has national security laws that make it illegal to say anything pro-communist, to say anything admiring North Korea. So you would not know it. There is no Communist Party of South Korea. It's illegal. There's no Socialist Party of South Korea. For a while, there was something called the Unified Progressive Party, and that was broken up by the government, and the leaders were put in prison because of it on a tape-recorded hypothetical conversation. They were having a hypothetical conversation. What if war breaks out? They said, what should we do? And they said, well, we'll have to defend ourselves because the government will come round us up. And because of that tape, they outlawed and arrested all the leaders of the Unified Progressive Party. I've interviewed leaders of the Korean American organizations and progressives from South Korea. I mean, there was a whole movement there in the 80s. There were a lot of protests against the presence of U.S. troops. U.S. troops. There was sexual assaults on women. There were U.S. troops who ran over civilians with their cars intentionally. There was a lot of anger at the presence of U.S. troops in South Korea. They're technically called the United Nations Force, but they're not. They're U.S. troops. It's the USA is there. And Trump has gotten a lot of flack for saying, why do we need to be there? And one of the right-wing attacks on Trump is that he was saying that he wanted to pull U.S. troops out of South Korea, interestingly. But yeah, there you go. That's the situation there. I mean, the Korean War is still technically going on, right? People don't talk about this, but the Korean War is still technically happening, right? The United States and North Korea are still technically at war. Right? There was never a treaty signed. The U.S. government does not recognize North Korea. So technically, the Korean War has not ended. That's an important thing to keep in mind. Yeah, and human rights in South Korea aren't perfect. They really aren't. I mean, there was a guy who got 2 years in prison for simply retweeting Kim Jong-un. He retweeted him, ironically, 2 years in prison. Right? So the story that we get about North Korea is very one-sided, and the story we get about South Korea is very one-sided, right? So, I think there should be peace on the Korean Peninsula. I know that North Korea, a lot of things there are very difficult, and that they have had a very military setup, and that it's a much more authoritarian country than they would like to be and that I would like to see. But that's because of the situation that they're in. Meanwhile, South Korea, they want to make it out like it's just this pure democracy where nothing bad ever happens. That's not necessarily true either. Look at what happens to striking workers and protesters in South Korea. Look at how flamethrowers are sometimes used against protesters, and the chemical weapons they use when the workers occupy their factories, and the student uprisings that have happened there. It's much more complicated. A lot of South Korea's existence has been a military dictatorship. Now, right now, they have free elections, but they broke up the Unified Progressive Party. It's much more complicated than you would believe. So I urge, I am for peaceful reunification of the Korean Peninsula. I would like to see the Korean Workers' Party and the government in the South form a unified government in which everyone's represented. That's what I would like to see, peaceful reunification of the Korean Peninsula. That would be a good thing. So there you go. Okay. Do you think that Nicaragua and Ortega will fall? No, I mean, the government of Nicaragua, the Sandinista government, has done so much to raise people out of poverty. I mean, they have had astronomical achievements. I mean, it's been massive. What they've done for the population of Nicaragua is astronomical. And that, in elections, nobody even comes close to them. And the opposition there, the opposition protests, it's like rich kids on the campuses. They don't have any support among the population. People want to make criticisms, and I'm sure there's plenty of criticism that can be made, but overwhelmingly, the economic record of socialism under Ortega and Murillo has been astronomically good. So many indigenous people have been raised out of poverty. And part of what, and I tweeted this out today, part of what has made Nicaragua successful is the government's ability to mobilize what they call micro entrepreneurs, right? It's the socialist government helps people just start their own businesses, and those businesses function, in line with the state central plan. But enabling so many low-income Nicaraguans to open their own businesses and open their own stores has made socialism strong. It's the slogan of the government of Nicaragua is Christianity, socialism, and solidarity. Rosario Murillo, who was, and Daniel Ortega, they have a lot of support. So there you go. That's all I can say. I hope that answers the question. Yeah, I don't think they're going to fall anytime soon. That's what I'll tell you. But there you go. Capitalist versus socialist billionaires. Okay, well, there's a couple layers to that. So first things first, right? Billionaire is just a measurement of wealth, right? I mean, it literally means you have more than $1 billion. That's what it means. I mean, it's not, So the goal of socialism is to create a world of so much material abundance that no state is even necessary, that no government is even necessary. That is the goal of socialism, is a world in which there is so much prosperity and so much wealth, and everyone has so much. There's no need for any crime. There's no need for any poverty, that people stop even having to have, keep track of who belongs to what. The goal is so much abundance existing that everyone lives far better than billionaires currently live, right? That's the goal. So the goal of socialism is a world in which everyone lives far more prosperously than billionaires currently live in our time. We, in our time, live better, for the most part, than millionaires lived in the 1800s, right? We have a higher living standard, right? In the 1800s, there were no record players. We can listen to music anytime we want. In the 1800s, the goal is for all of humanity to live far better than billionaires currently have. That's the goal of socialism. And the only way that communism, the ultimate goal of a stateless, classless world, is possible is if that level of abundance exists. So the reason that I oppose saying abolish billionaires is because it implies that we don't want extravagance and wealth and comfort and prosperity to expand for the entire population. And that is wrong. The goal of socialism is to raise the level of material abundance far higher for all of humanity. We want everyone in the world to live far better than billionaires live now. The enemy is not wealth. The enemy is poverty. The goal is to raise the level of material abundance so high that the state isn't necessary. So when you say abolish billionaires, you probably mean, it's not right for people to exploit other people. You probably mean it's not right for some to have so much while others have so few. That I'm with you on. What I'm not with you on is this notion that wealth itself is a problem. That's dangerous, and that's no-growth politics. Right? When you say that there's a certain level of wealth that people have, that they shouldn't have more than that, no, the issue isn't wealth. The issue is poverty. I'm for the abolition of poverty, not the abolition of wealth. And the problem with billionaires isn't that they have billions of dollars. It's how they got it. Most of the billionaires in our society got their wealth by making other people poor, by exploiting other people, and by doing things that lead to mass poverty. Their wealth comes as the result of impoverishing others. That's the problem. Now, someone asked about capitalist billionaires versus socialist billionaires. Well, in socialist societies that currently exist, like, China, like Vietnam, like Venezuela, you do have some billionaires. And if you look at how they acquired their wealth by making their country wealthier. The goal is working people controlling workplaces. I'll address that. Oh, that's so ignorant. But they acquired their wealth. Yeah, I specifically said I'm not going to answer the second chat that I got there. So I did a whole rant about it. I'm not answering questions about that. So suicide rates in South Korea. I don't know about the suicide rates in South Korea, but let me write that down. Suicide rates in South Korea. Alrighty. Now, Jack Ma, for example. He's a billionaire. He's in China. He's a member of the Communist Party. And he acquired his wealth by organizing and creating something called Alibaba, which is a marketing distribution outfit that enables the socialist economy of China to flourish. And it's been very successful. And, you need people like that in a socialist society, right? The state-run, centrally planned economy of China has really benefited from Jack Ma creating Alibaba. So Jack Ma himself has very much benefited from it. right? Isabel dos Santos, right? Now she is a billionaire from Angola, and she has worked with the state-run oil company to raise people out of poverty. She worked to help Angola have its own cell phone company. She worked to help Angola have its own manufacturing, and she's done a lot, and she's done it in accordance with the MPLA central plan of the economy. But she, in order to bring in foreign investment and all that, she's become very wealthy, right? And if we had socialism in the United States, for example, right? We nationalized our oil, we nationalized our major industries. If we did that, wouldn't we have people whose job it was to arrange for us to sell our major industries? Like, if all the cars were national, if we had nationalized car manufacturing in the United States, wouldn't there be people whose job it was to arrange export deals to sell American cars to other countries? Sure. Wouldn't they want to be incentivized by getting a share of how many cars they sell? Of course. So, yeah. And so, they're going to make profits. That there's going to be a layer of people in socialist countries who are able, by enabling the socialist economy to function stronger, they set up business deals, they make money. That's very different than owners of capitalist corporations that rake in profits by beating countries down all over the world and get richer by making the society poor. There's a difference. The problem with capitalism is not wealth. The problem with capitalism is not people having money. The problem is that the banks, factories, and industries operate according to the logic of the market. Capitalism is profits in command. Capitalism, as Frederick Engels put it, this is what Frederick Engels said about capitalism, is under capitalism, the means of production only function as preliminary transformation into capital. Right? Mao Zedong, he said, under capitalism, profits are in command. Right? And it's when the economy functions according to what's profitable, not what's best for society, that's capitalism. But when the major means of production are controlled by the state, when there's a state central plan, when production is carried out upon a predetermined plan, as Frederick Engels put it, that's socialism. But in a socialist state, there are going to be people who are able to arrange deals or set up businesses that are in a line with the overall socialist vision, and they're going to become wealthy. And they'll become wealthy as the rest of society becomes wealthy. But they won't be the ruling class. Right? And I've often made this analogy. But under capitalism, corporations control the government. Under socialism, the government controls the corporations. Right? Under a socialist state, the capitalists who do exist, the private corporations that do exist, live in fear of the state. The state tells them what to do. They exist simply at the whim of the socialist state. Whereas in this country, the government exists simply at the whim of the corporations. So there you go. Okay, someone asked about multipolarity and internationalism. Well, see, these are two different concepts. Okay, so multipolarity is the notion that the world shouldn't be centered around the West and the United States. And there should be multiple poles of power within the global world, right? The idea is that, especially since the end of the Cold War, the world has basically been centered around the United States, maybe the United States and Western Europe, but mostly the United States. And that there's one pole, there's unipolarity. The world is centered around one thing. And that's unhealthy. There should be other poles of power in the world. And if you didn't know, anyone who suggests multipolarity is secretly a Nazi, according to some people. So you're not allowed to say that word. I just said multipolarity. So I'm sure there's people going, he's a Nazi. It's ridiculous. But yeah, that's multipolarity, is the idea there should be multiple poles of influence in the global economy. It shouldn't all be centered around one country. Internationalism is a notion, proletarian internationalism. That's a notion that comes out of Marxism. Workers of the world unite. There should be class unity, and that should trump national barriers, right? That workers shouldn't be mobilized against each other on the basis of their nationality. There should be solidarity among workers of different nationalities, different races. The workers of the world unite. The whole world comes first. That's internationalism, and these are two different concepts. What I think we're in the verge of gradually moving toward is a world with a different kind of economy, a world where we have different countries that trade with each other, but they don't trade with each other in a predatory manner. They trade with each other on the basis of win-win cooperation. And, the economies are organized to serve public good and not profits. The means of production are controlled by society. The people have the power, not profits. And that countries trade with each other on a win-win basis. There's no predatory. It's not like corporations based in one country dominate the world and beat down other countries. Some countries don't get rich at the expense of others. International relations is not viewed as a zero-sum game. So that's kind of how I see things. I guess, sure, that's a multipolar view, but that's also an internationalist view. So there you go. Alrighty. All right. I was asked to rate Chinese leaders from Mao to Xi. Well, I don't really want to do that. There are things about Mao that are very good. There are other things about Mao, especially in the final years of his life when the Gang of Four was in power that were pretty bad. Deng Xiaoping, he saved China from a counter-revolution. He raised living standards a lot. He also invaded Vietnam and the whole Kampuchea thing. And, there are things about Deng Xiaoping that are not as good. I like what Xi Jinping is doing. I like his writings. I encourage people to read them. I've heard there's a third volume of The Governance of China by Xi Jinping coming out. That's very exciting, so I can't wait to see that. But no, I don't want to rate them from best to worst. I'm not comfortable doing that. But I hope you understand it. And I hope that you look into the good things there. And I hope that you don't repeat, anti-communist lies and smears. And, I think that they're all great. They all have their pluses and their minuses. And you should study Deng Xiaoping's writings. You should study Xi Jinping's writings. You should study Mao's writings. Look at what the Chinese Communist Party is putting out. Read their understanding of Marxism. Even if you don't agree with it, engage with it, right? China, this is a country led by a communist party. It is the largest country in the world in terms of population. And it's led by a communist party. There are pictures of Mao and Marx and Lenin everywhere. They had a huge 200-year celebration for Marx's birth. This is a huge country that has raised millions out of poverty, that has the second largest economy in the world, and it's led by a group of Marxists. Now, you would think that even if you don't agree with China, even if you have a negative opinion of China, if you're a Marxist, you would think, okay, I need to read what China's putting out about Marxism. If you are for the multipolar world, you are a Eurasianist. Okay? Bipolar world is a better transition. Well, all right. I'm not a Eurasianist, so yeah, I don't know what you're getting at there. But no, I think that having a multipolar world is kind of common sense, and that having the world centered around the West is, it leads to problems. So I think countries should be friendly toward each other. So there you go. But you would think that, that countries trading with each other, right, on the basis of win-win cooperation, scratch that. You would think that if you were interested in Marxism and you see, a country that is led by a Marxist party that has achieved so much and is the largest country in the world in terms of population, is this, second largest economy in the whole world, you would think that if you're seriously a Marxist, you would want to read what they were publishing. You would read, Governance of China, the chapters on socialism in there, the quotes from Marx. You would read President Xi's writings and the Marxist books he quotes and references. You would study their viewpoint. And maybe you wouldn't agree with it, but you'd at least engage with it. But the way China is treated among people in the United States that are left is that they just say, China bad, China bad, China bad. And that's the end of discussion. And I'm sorry, but if you consider yourself a Marxist, and there's one of the biggest countries in the world is led by a Marxist party, and they've achieved so much, and you don't even want to read about it, because it might change your worldview. You're too busy reading Herbert Marcuse and Susan Sontag. Well, I pity you, because, you're really not doing yourself a very good service, right? This points to the problem of the Western left. I'm writing a book on the synthetic left and all of that. So there you go. All right, bonapartism. All right, so there's a book by Karl Marx called The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, or Louis Napoleon, I think. And it's about the fact that in France in 1851, there was a military coup by what they called the Party of Order. And it was a military coup in which, the nephew of Napoleon declared himself the dictator. There was all these strikes and protests happening among the French working class, and there were some monarchists running around. So, Louis Bonaparte, Napoleon III became the dictator. And he enacted a huge amount of reforms to French society in the hopes of stabilizing the country and holding off some kind of revolution and fixing the economy. And it's called bonapartism. When one section of the ruling class, the Military History Channel is running docs about, ooh, someone repeat that super chat. It went by way too fast. Someone repeat it. History Channel is running docs about what? Repeat it, repeat it, repeat it. I don't want any super chat to be missed. I appreciate super chats. They deserve an answer. About Nazism. That Nazis influenced Hezbollah or something like that. All right. We'll talk about that. Okay. Alrighty. Okay. So bonapartism is when one section of the ruling class asserts itself, takes control of the state, and asserts itself over the rest of the ruling class in order to try and stabilize society. And that's what, Napoleon III did. He represented the finance capitalists of France, and Marx wrote a whole book about this. Some people thought Louis Bonaparte was a revolutionary. He wasn't. He took power, and he legalized labor unions. He created hospitals for poor people in the urban areas. He built railroads in France. He did a lot of really dramatic, progressive stuff. But, was he a socialist? How do we explain the claims annexing South China Sea? All right, we'll talk about South China Sea. Alrighty. So the claim was that, Louis Bonaparte was some kind of revolutionary or something. He wasn't. Louis Bonaparte was just a regular, capitalist leader. But there was a crisis in society. There were protests going on. The economy was grinding and suffering. And so as a result of that, Louis Bonaparte and the Party of Order seized power and did a lot of progressive stuff. And they did it in the hopes of stabilizing society. And that's what was going on. And Marx wrote about it. And he wrote this pamphlet analyzing what was happening. And there's a lot of bombastic words in it. That's where the phrase, first time is tragedy, second time is farce, that's where it comes from. There's a lot of other quotes in it where Marx is analyzing what has happened and how the capitalists are desperately trying to save their system and giving up notions of democracy in order to save capitalism. And that Louis Napoleon depended on the working class to stay in power. He was a member of the capitalist class, and he represented one faction of the capitalist class, but he needed the working class to have his back, and that's why he did all these progressive reforms. That's why he, legalized labor unions. That's why he supported farmers. That's why he built the railroads. He did all of this because he needed workers to have his back against the rest of the capitalists. That's basically what it was. And bonapartism is when one section of the ruling class seizes power and uses the state, to suppress other sections of the ruling class. It's when one section of the ruling class puts themselves above all society. And in some cases, that involves them, really working to the benefit of some workers. It involves heavy repression of members of their own class. They imprison and arrest and execute a lot of other capitalists. That's what bonapartism is. There's left-wing bonapartism. I think Roosevelt was a left-wing Bonapartist, right? He represented the Rockefellers and one section of the American ruling class. And so he, like Louis Napoleon, he aligned with the working class. He aligned with the communists and the labor unions, and he enacted all kinds of progressive reforms. That's one form of Bonapartism. There's also reactionary Bonapartism. Hitler, right? He represented one section of the German working class, but he also represented a very big section of the German capitalist class, the industrial, capitalists like Krupp and Tyson, and they seized control of the government and violently suppressed other members of the ruling class and violently beat down the communists in the hopes of stabilizing the economy. And that this is what happens when there's a capitalist crisis. Due to the falling rate of profit, problems of overproduction, when there's a crisis in society, one section of the ruling class violently seizes power and attempts to use the government to stabilize the economy. And in order to do it, they have to have millions of working class people who are loyal to them, right? That's Bonapartism. And Marx witnessed it in 1851 in France, and it happened, all over the world. It's happened in many countries. A lot of third world countries have been, had Bonapartist regimes, for like all of the Cold War era, right? It's one section of the ruling class violently suppressing other sections of the ruling class and building a mass movement of workers to back them up in the hopes of stabilizing society. That's what it is. And it's a phenomenon. And when there's a capitalist crisis, it happens. Trump was trying to be somewhat of a bonapartist, and I mean, he hasn't really enacted very many reforms, but he's certainly loyal to one section of his class and very hostile to other sections of his class. And his goal is to stabilize society. So there's Bonapartist elements in Trump. Nixon was a little bit of a Bonapartist, I think. So yeah, that's what Bonapartism is, and it's a very important concept. Go and read the Eighth Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte by Karl Marx. It's a very good pamphlet. And then go and read about background information about Louis Bonaparte and what he did and how it worked. Understand that concept because it's a very important concept, right? There's a Marxist song by Cornelius Cardew. It's called Lords of Labor. But one of the verses of the song, he says, "The capitalists fight with one another to corner the markets and divide up the world. Their quest for maximum profits is the cause of war and puts us out the door. Their greed leads them into a crisis, which they try to resolve with a more fascist state. Our struggles against the whole capitalist system, so strike out the fascists as well as the capitalists." Yeah, not the best lyrics ever, but yeah, I mean, the capitalists fight with one another to corner the markets and divide up the world. That's what's going on. Their greed leads them into a crisis, overproduction, which they try to resolve with a more fascist state, right, where one section of the ruling class tries to take over the government and resolve the crisis. And the struggle is against the whole capitalist system, so strike out the fascists as well as the capitalists. That's Cornelius Cardew. Not the most poetic lyrics ever, but he's really explaining what happens. When there is a crisis of capitalism, one section of the ruling class will try to resolve the crisis by suppressing violently members of their own class, right? And if you want to read more about this, I would recommend checking out the work of Georgy Dimitrov. Caleb, you have the best followers on the internet, hands down. Well, thank you, Kinky. We're having fun here, I always have fun with you all, and yeah, we're doing the best we can. Alrighty, it's great. And make this a bigger conversation. Bring more people on board. Let's keep going with this. All right, that's Bonapartism. All right, Haiti, autocratic government. Absolutely. Nobody ever talks about Haiti. Right? How Haiti has shot down protesters in the streets, how, Haiti has killed innocent people. Haiti, the people are starving and eating dirt mixed with oil and all because of capitalism. But there's no human rights propaganda on CNN against the Haitian government. There's no, regime change calls against Haiti because it's a free market capitalist government. It signed NAFTA. It's wrecked its economy. It's controlled by Western corporations. Haiti, that is what Western capitalism can offer. Compare Haiti to Cuba. Compare Haiti to Cuba. Haiti, the capitalism of Haiti, the capitalism in Haiti. No one ever says that's capitalism there. It's capitalism if you've ever seen it. It's a free market country. It's capitalism. And shooting people down in the streets for protesting, horrendous stuff goes on there. The poverty that they've been subjected to, it's like revenge, right? This was the first slave revolution. The slaves of Haiti rose up and broke their chains, and the imperialists have been punishing them for it ever since. Alrighty. Thomas Sankara, right, was the leader of Burkina Faso, a revolutionary, and they asked about African revolutionaries like him. Kwame Nkrumah, right, great revolutionary leader. Julius Nyerere, the founder of modern Tanzania. Julius Nyerere. Who else? There's many African revolutionary leaders that have fought for their people and done amazing things. Mengistu in Ethiopia, right, the leader of the Derg in Ethiopia, which brought literacy to millions of people, redistributed land. You can talk about in Angola. What's been done, what the MPLA has done in Angola to raise people out of poverty, despite 27 years of civil war they've been subject to. Nelson Mandela was a communist. Robert Mugabe, right, the land redistribution campaigns there and the stuff he did in terms of, I remember I attended the World Festival of Youth and Students, and I met with people from Zimbabwe. And one of the things they talked about is that China has worked with Zimbabwe to build a hotel next to the Victoria Falls. right? Victoria Falls. It's the world's largest waterfall. It's in Zimbabwe. But because of capitalism and sanctions and all of that, tourists from all over the world would love to see the Victoria Falls, the biggest waterfall in the world. But they can't see it because Western capitalism and sanctions won't let them bring in foreign investment. So China has worked with Zimbabwe to set up, tourism to Victoria Falls. Great. Great. That's a good thing. It's a very, very good thing. So, but you'll never hear about that. So, Zimbabwe in terms of land redistribution, in terms of literacy, they've done a lot. I mean, there are many African revolutionary leaders, but the fall of the Soviet Union was devastating. Many African countries were fighting for their freedom, and the Soviet Union was giving them aid, and then the fall of the Soviet Union, was devastating. China's role in Africa is phenomenal. China has invested so much, built so many railways and power plants, and they don't want to talk about that. Western media makes it sound like, China's making things worse for Africans. And I'm sure that there's things China's doing in Africa that aren't good, okay? Let's not pretend that nothing bad ever goes on. But the role of China in Africa is phenomenal. They're playing a very, very good role, and it's hard to deny that. You can pick out little situations, but China's doing amazing stuff in Africa. And Cuba, intervened. I mean, Cuba has sent military forces to Angola to fight against invaders and to support the MPLA. So there's whole histories there of great stuff. All right. Now, someone asked about books on Gaddafi's accomplishments. Well, one of the best books on that is Cynthia McKinney, the former U.S. Congresswoman from Georgia. She wrote a very, very good very, very good book about Libya and her trip to Libya and what the Gaddafi government has achieved. So I would recommend checking out Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney's book. I would recommend that. But there's other good books, and I'm going to read to you, from the introduction. My introduction to Gaddafi's Green Book talks a lot about that. I have a lot of economic data and stuff in here. So once I'm done with your super chats, I'll actually read to you from a good book about Libya's economic achievements. But yeah, check out Cynthia McKinney's book. It's good stuff. All right. Someone said, should there be international observers at the U.S. election? Well, you're not the only person saying that. You're really not the only person saying that. Because, Trump is concerned about the mail, the postal ballots and potential for fraud there. Other people are talking about under these circumstances with the pandemic, would people stay home? People are looking at this election. And they're looking at the nightmare of the election we just had in New York City, where people were given partial ballots, right? In Chelsea, in New York City, all kinds of people went to vote and they didn't give them the whole ballot. That's crooked. A lot of people were given incorrect ballots. There were a lot of mail-in ballots that were lost. In New Jersey, there were guys that were arrested because they had, basements full of mail-in ballots that they illegally possessed. I interviewed Marnie Halassa, who's running for city council in New York. I interviewed her about the election, debacle in New York City. Our election that we had here, the primary we had amid the pandemic 2 weeks ago, was a nightmare. It was an absolute disaster. And now with most people going to be voting through the mail in November, this is going to be a wild election with Kanye West running. And over 40 years, some 50,000 Chinese men and women were journeying to Africa to build the linking Tanzania and the African continent. That's true, yeah. Tanzania, Julius Nyerere was the socialist leader of Tanzania, and he worked with China to build railroads. And China sent a lot of people there. And this was during the Cultural Revolution. This was before Deng Xiaoping, that there was a huge Chinese effort to build railroads in Tanzania. And there was a book about it that I had years ago. I don't think I have it anymore, about Julius Nyerere and what China did. At that point, China made a big point of trying to differentiate themselves from the Soviet Union. So they made a point of that the workers that China sent didn't live any better than average people in Tanzania. And there was a huge effort to be very, very friendly and supportive to the local population. It was during the Cultural Revolution, and that was kind of the first Chinese real role in building things in Africa was those railroads. But now China's building railroads in Africa all the time. Yeah, very good observation there. But yeah, international, the U.S. elections, I have no idea how it's going to come out. It says workers controlling the workplace is the goal. No, see, that's the thing. Here's the thing. Workers controlling the workplace is good. I am in favor of worker cooperatives. I'm in favor of workplace democracy. That's not all of what socialism is about. right? Socialism, if you read Marx, can you talk about the Winnipeg General Strike? I don't know enough about it. I can't talk about that. I just don't know enough about it. But if you read Marx, right, the problem with capitalism is it's production carried out not for use, but for profit. And it's an economy organized for profit. And when the economy is organized for profit, that leads to a problem called overproduction. And overproduction is the fact that the capitalist is driving to produce more goods as the maximum amount of goods with the lowest rate of pay, right? He wants to pay as little as he can to produce as much as possible. And workers are also consumers. And so as pretty soon you have a market glutted with products that can't be sold. The worker can never buy back the product he produces. And this leads to the boom-bust cycle. On top of that, you have the falling rate of profit as technology increases. The rate of exploitation also decreases because the capitalist can only exploit the surplus value created by the worker, right? Machines don't make surplus value. So as you push people out of production, as there's less and less labor involved in production, there's less and less profit margin for the capitalist. His rate of profit decreases. And it all leads to a capitalist crisis. I mean, that's the problem with capitalism. And worker cooperatives don't exactly resolve that, right? I mean, the workers still have a share, right? I mean, the workers aren't being exploited because they're making profits. They're getting a share of the profits, but it's still production for profit. Worker co-ops would compete with other worker co-ops, and there's worker co-ops still function according to profits, right? They're still trying to maximize their revenue, and they would eliminate jobs with technology. Why would they do that? Because then the fewer people there are, the bigger of a share that all the people that are left get, right? Worker co-ops, imagine there was a military manufacturing worker co-op. It would be in their interest, to start wars because they would sell more weapons, right? It would be in the interest of worker cooperatives in one country to beat down and impoverish other countries so they could sell their products there and not have competitors, right? Right now, China makes a lot of steel, right? If every worker in the American steel industry had a share, got a share of the profits, do you think they wouldn't want to beat down China and roll China out of the market so that everyone had to buy their steel from American, steel mills? Of course they would, because it's like it doesn't eliminate the problem of production for profit. It's good. Worker co-ops are more efficient because people have more of a say and people have more incentive to work. That's good. Worker co-ops are going to be an essential part of socialism, but they are not the essence of what socialism is. And they don't eliminate the problems of production for profit. You need a state central plan. That's what, and that's the reality. And by going around and saying, people say that socialism is just, every business becomes a worker cooperative. No, it's not. And, and a lot of employee stock ownership programs exist. ESOPs, they're called. Employee stock ownership programs. The wages of workers in many different industries is based on how much they produce. Costco and, worker co-ops are good. Lenin Farms in Russia is a worker co-op where the working people there get 3 times the pay of an average worker. They go to really good schools that are set up by the farm cooperative. Huawei Technologies is a worker cooperative, and Harvard Business Review did a great piece on how it's a great example of profit sharing working, and how the reason Huawei Technologies has done so many amazing things in terms of the phones is because of the cooperative nature of it. What else? There's cooperatives in Venezuela. I visited worker cooperatives that make cement in Venezuela, for example. Worker cooperatives are good, okay? But they're not the essence of socialism. Socialism is eliminating the rule of profits. Socialism is an economy where a central plan exists. Socialism is when you have a government of action that fights for working families. That's what socialism is. Socialism is when the economy works in the interests of public good overall, not the profits of owners, right? And there can be capitalist market sectors, there can be cooperatives, there can be huge state-run enterprises, but when the state controls the means of production, that's socialism. It's, just every employee getting a stock share is not the essence of what socialism is. I hate to break it to you. And if you would listen to certain voices that are out there, you would be confused about this. And I understand why you're confused about this, because there's a lot of confusion out there about this, because they're afraid of this, right? Ben Shapiro, there's a classic clip of this kid gets up and says to Ben Shapiro, what if I want to open a pencil factory? Sure, everything you've said about China and Russia and all the socialist countries, yeah, they're all evil and it's true, but what if I want to open a pencil factory? Yee-hee. And if you watch that clip, Ben Shapiro says, yeah, if you want to open a pencil factory, it's cooperative. I don't have a problem with it. Yeah, the capitalists don't care. If you and your buddy want to go start a worker cooperative, they're not going to arrest you. They're not going to lock you in jail. I mean, how does that threaten capitalism at all? I mean, I'm for worker cooperatives, and I would like to start one eventually. But it's not going to defeat capitalism. Defeating capitalism requires the state to control the means of production. You and your buddy starting a worker-owned pencil factory is not really a threat to capitalism. I mean, the chances of you outdoing all the successful pencil, you should do stand-up on the Upper East Side, Caleb, trust me. Well, there you go. But yeah, I mean, you and your friends starting a pencil factory, no libertarian will oppose you. No free marketeer will oppose you. There's nothing threatening to capitalism about that. Nothing. We need a government of action. We need the state to control the means of production. We need the state to fight for the people. We need a government of action that fights for working families, not a weak, pathetic government that works for the capitalists. We need a government that works for the people and controls the economy to make sure people have what they need. I don't know what the suicide rate in South Korea is, so I can't comment on it. All right, someone asked about Nazi influence on Hezbollah. Well, here's the thing, okay? Unfortunately, in the Middle East, you have to remember who was the main colonizers of people in the Middle East during World War II. At the time of World War II, right, after World War I, the Middle East was divided up by the imperialists with the Sykes-Picot Agreement, right? It was a secret treaty that the Bolsheviks made public, the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And the French and the British, they divided up the Middle East, right? And so that happened. Then World War II broke out later. And during the Second World War, the British and the Americans and the Soviet Union were allies against the Nazis. And there were many Arab nationalists who had a kind of enemy of my enemy is my friend attitude and felt like, well, the British was their main enemy. The Americans and the French were their main enemy. And we're a little bit confused about World War II. Workers of Ontario. Great song. Check it out. Yeah, thanks for the super chat. And there was a lot of confusion about that, right? Now, not all Arab leaders did that. But, Israel makes a big deal out of this, makes a very big deal out of this. And there's truth in it. I mean, there were Kenyans, for example, who admired Hitler. There were Kenyans, who hated the British in Kenya. Kenyan, anti-British activists who supported Hitler. There were Irish people who supported Hitler. The British Empire, this is what people don't understand. Before Hitler, right, there was the British Empire. The British Empire killed millions of people. The British Empire, carried out many, 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 many holocausts in India, in the Middle East, in Africa, and in the Philippines, all over the world, the British Empire has killed millions of people. And nobody talks about this now, right? Now, because, the British Empire kind of got off the scene after World War II, we don't talk about it. But in India, the British killed literally millions of people, right? Famine after famine after famine, man-made famine. In Ireland, millions of people. At one point, they killed something like 15% of the population. Right? The British in Iraq, for example, after World War II, this is a great example. After World War II in Iraq, the Arabs revolted. And so the British used poison gas against the Arab people, and they poison gassed whole neighborhoods in Iraq. And, we're using poison gas. And after World War I, you'll remember, poison gas and chemical warfare had been outlawed by the Geneva Convention. But they used poison gas anyway. And they asked Winston Churchill, how can you be using poison gas against the Arabs when you just signed the Geneva Convention that says you can't use poison gas? And he says, well, the Geneva Convention applies to men, not uncivilized tribes. Right? That was the British Empire. They killed millions of people. Millions of people were killed by the British Empire. Okay? So if you were somebody in the third world, who had seen your people suffer at the hands of the British Empire in India, in the Middle East, in South America, in the, in the Pacific, in Africa, and you didn't know anything about Hitler. You might think, oh, okay, especially if you were anti-communist. You have to remember, if you were, more of a middle-class bourgeois element, you might think, oh, well, maybe this Hitler guy, at least he's fighting the British. And there's a lot of confusion like that, unfortunately. In fact, there's actually a very good book, a novel, written by a member of the Communist Party named Richard Wright, and it's called Native Son, and it was published in 1939. It's one of the most famous African-American novels in the United States. And in Native Son, Richard Wright talks about, the main character is Bigger Thomas. And Bigger Thomas is in the movie theater, and he sees a newsreel, about Hitler, and he's an African-American man, and he turns to his friend in the movie theater and says to his friend, I wish my people had someone like that, right? And he sees this German guy talking about fighting for his race and all of that, and, so much solidarity. Thank you so much, and thank you for all the brilliant people in your chat. Thank you, Kinky. I appreciate it. But yeah, I mean, he says, as a black man in the United States, he sees this guy on a screen who's military and big and yelling and waving his arms. And he thinks, he says to his friend, I wish we black people had somebody like Hitler. And he's confused, right? And that for a lot of oppressed people around the world whose main enemy was the British or the Americans, in South America, there were a lot of Hitler admirers for the same reason. The Americans, the Monroe Doctrine, the Americans had been their main enemy. And so Hitler was fighting the Americans. So they thought, hey, maybe he's onto something, right? That this happens, right? And, it's confusion. It's just confusion, right? And there are statements by black leaders. Let's not forget the Nation of Islam. During World War II, they supported Japan, and they urged their members not to fight in World War II. Now, I think they were wrong. I think World War II, it was necessary to join the U.S. military to defeat the Nazis, but you can understand why African Americans in the United States would not want to support the U.S. government and would think, I'm not going to go kill Asian people for the white man. And you can understand why the Nation of Islam did that. And, the founder of the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad, he actually went to prison, for encouraging black people not to fight in World War II. So you can understand this confusion goes on. So that's the bigger picture there. But there's some specifics about what you asked about. There's some specifics that also need to be addressed. For example, all over the Middle East and all over the world, people do that salute, okay? And you know which salute I'm referring to. Well, look up the name of that salute. It's called the Roman salute. That's actually what it's called because it was used by the Roman Empire. And in the Middle East, for many years, people have used that salute because, it's the Middle East, and going back thousands of years, people have used that salute. And so there's a lot of pro-Israel forces that take a picture of Hezbollah people or, Abdel Nasser or somebody doing that salute, and they say, aha, see, he's a Nazi. Well, okay, over here, if somebody does that salute, we know what they're saying. Over there, not necessarily, right? I mean, great example. I was in the subway, a few months back, and I saw two Chinese tourists. And one of them, they were teenage girls from China. They didn't speak a word of English, and they were walking around with their shopping bags. And one of them was wearing a green jacket with a Confederate flag on it. And I pointed to that flag. I said, that flag. And she just looked at me weird, because it doesn't mean that in China. In China, there's probably people who buy Confederate flags all the time because it doesn't mean that. They just think it's a symbol and it looks American and it was in an American movie. They don't know what it means. You know what I'm saying? Here, wearing a Confederate flag is a racist statement. In China, it means you have fancy clothes from America and you watch Dukes of Hazzard or something. And that's the thing. You have to understand the implications. Like the swastika, for example, the Falun Gong. The actual symbol of the Falun Gong is a swastika. I'm not a big fan of the Falun Gong. I don't think the Falun Gong uses the swastika because they hate Jews. They use it because that's an ancient symbol in India. And, you have to understand, symbols don't mean the same thing around the world. But yes, there's a lot of confusion in the developing world when it comes to World War II among people that were colonized by the British. And Israel, let's add that now that Israel is the main enemy of Arab people that are fighting for their national liberation, that has exacerbated this confusion and made this confusion even more extreme. Right? So, when I'm in the developing world and I hear people say things about the Holocaust and stuff like that, they're not saying this because they're the same as Richard Spencer. They're saying it because they're confused, right? And I'm sorry that happens, and I don't support any of that. I do not support anti-Semitism at all. And And honestly, I mean, anti-Semitism is a big, big, if we remove the stars from that flag, well, there you go. And I'm sure, see, that's the thing. In that part of the world, the Confederate flag doesn't have that meaning. And that's the thing, right? That there are people around the world who are very, very confused. We're very, very, very confused about things, right? And, that's all I can say about that. And that, people in Lebanon using that salute, they're using that because that's the Roman salute. That's a salute Arabs have used going back thousands of years. They're not using that to refer to a certain leader in Germany. However, are there statements by people all over the Middle East and all over India and all over Pakistan and all over South America that are very confused about World War II, and they say things about World War II that are deeply, deeply wrong? Of course, right? Have there been black nationalist activists like, Marcus Garvey, who have made statements about World War II that are deeply, deeply wrong? Yes, there have been. It's not the same thing, right? White supremacists, white nationalists, they mean one thing, they're doing one thing. People of color that are anti-imperialist are doing something else, right? I know everyone was very upset. There was a deeply insensitive and offensive statement made by a black activist on the internet, and he was attacking. It was so sad. It was heartbreaking to me to see this black activist was attacking who was the Holocaust victim who wrote Anne Frank, right? And this black activist, I'm sure just a young person, was confused, was filled with rage, was not thinking about what they were saying, didn't get it. He wrote like a very offensive statement about Anne Frank, and it's heartbreaking. But I don't think that activist made that statement because he's just a dirty, rotten anti-Semite. I think he's confused. Okay? He's confused. And he's filled with resentment. He feels like nobody cares about him, and nobody cares about the things that happen to his community. He's filled with resentment. And he made a very, very incorrect association. And he said a thing that's pretty indefensible. But he said it out of confusion. Okay? And that's the thing. He didn't say it because he's the same as a neo-Nazi. Okay? He said it because he's confused. And I don't condone anything that he said. You can downplay the Holocaust or downplay, the crimes of anti-Semitism or downplay, misogyny. But you can understand that when someone is suffering and they feel like their oppression is not being acknowledged, they will sometimes downplay other people's suffering. And that's the poisonous reality of identity politics. That's what identity politics does. When you don't have a class line, when there's no class struggle, it leads to that. It leads to, I'm the most oppressed. No, I'm the most oppressed. No, I'm the most oppressed. No, I'm the most oppressed. You have it too good. No, you have it too good. Oh, yeah, well, you've got it too good. You've got it too good. No, you've got it too good. That's what it leads to. And that's a toxic conversation. It is a toxic, toxic conversation. It's toxic. It's toxic. But the basis of that conversation, the reason people have that kind of conversation, it's about more than ID poll, okay? It's about the belief that the pie is only this big. The pie is only this big. And when the pie is only a certain size, the only way your slice of the pie can get bigger is by cutting into somebody else's slice. And nobody ever thinks that their slice of the pie is too big, all right? Everyone wishes they had more than they already had. So if you declare that we can't have more, that growth is bad, abolish billionaires, human progress has got to end, there's too much wealth in the world, if you declare what the synthetic left has declared, that growth is bad, that wealth itself is bad, then the pie is only this big. And then immediately the fight starts. Your slice is too big, mine is too small. Your slice is too big. Your slice. That's how that fight starts. That's not Marxism. Marxism says that if we can rationally control the economy, if the means of production can be organized in a rational way, if human science and reason can dictate the means of production and production, instead of the chaos of the market, if human rational thinking and science can control the economy, we can make the pie inevitably bigger. We can invent new means of technology. We can go into outer space. We can have fusion energy. We can do amazing. The pie can just keep expanding infinitely because of human brilliance and creativity, right? And that narrative is what the synthetic left was set up to combat. And that's why the Rockefeller think tanks have pushed overpopulation. They've pushed Malthusianism. They've pushed, eco-pessimism, because they realize that if the pie is this big, they'll lose their place at the top of the food chain really, really quick. And that's the reality of it all, right? That socialism is about growth. It's about state central planning and human scientific reason. There's an old poster from the Soviet Union that says socialism is science applied to the economy. So there you go. Oh boy, they're going to have a great time distorting everything I just said there, but who cares, right? All right, South China Sea. Last super chat I got was about the South China Sea. Yeah, so here's the thing about the South China Sea, right? China, they realize that the biggest weakness they have is that China is an oil importing country, right? They import their oil. They have some oil they get on pipelines from Russia, but most of their oil comes by sea. Do I need to read Marxist theory to be a Marxist? Yes, you do. That was easy. Yes. But yeah, most of their oil comes by sea, right? That China is weak because it depends on foreign oil imports, right? They have their domestic oil production is not big enough. Wanted to say, hearing you speak, it's very reassuring to me. It's about time someone talks about Malthusianism's influence on the left. Well, thank you. It's an important issue. I'm going to keep talking about it. It needs to be said. Malthusianism is a big problem. But the South China Sea, is where most of China's oil comes from. It's Shanghai ports in southern China is where their oil is imported. And the United States knows that if they ever want to really screw over China, all they have to do is build a naval blockade in the South China Sea, and China's screwed. They know that, right? And that's a weakness that China has. So China is building up, imports all of its oils from the Straits of Malacca. The U.S. wants it can blockade the trade route. Exactly, brave New Perth. That's exactly what I'm saying. So China has to build up the South China Sea to make sure that doesn't happen. That's what that's about, is that China, it doesn't want the United States to have the oil veto over the Chinese economy. And I've said this in many articles, that's what it's about. And that's why China is pushing alternative energy like crazy. That's why they sent that rover to the moon, is because they want to get us off of fossil fuels, because fossil fuels is one of the biggest weaknesses in the Chinese economy, right? That fossil fuels is a vulnerability that China has. A naval blockade would destroy China. If the USA wanted to just end China, they set up that blockade and China's screwed. So China, is having an increased military presence in the South China Sea to make sure that doesn't happen. That's what it's about. And that's why it's happening. Since you're on China, what do you think about the animosity between Maoists in the Philippines and the CCP? I don't know enough about the Maoists in the Philippines. I just don't know enough about them. So that's it. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think that if I'm not mistaken, in what ways can we help support the CPI? Okay, well, the Maoists in the Philippines, I assume that they come out of the pro-Gang of Four tradition, where they don't recognize Deng Xiaoping as being socialist. So I think that they're not, in that sense, they're not pro-Chinese mainland. Other than that, I really don't know enough about them. I really haven't followed it, so I really don't know. And I don't speak for them. And, China, sometimes what they do internationally isn't good. During the Gang of Four era, China did awful things. China's foreign policy up into the 90s was pretty problematic. It's gotten a lot better recently, but China still recognizes Israel, which I don't support. It's like, China being socialist isn't based on them doing everything right internationally. Let me tell you that much. But yeah, I don't know enough about the Maoists in the Philippines. I don't know their positions and their critiques of China enough to give you a straight answer. What can you do to help the CPI? Well, go to the website, cpi-usa.org. We are at this point on the brink. We are going to have a fall conference in November in Los Angeles. It's probably going to happen. It's a matter of booking the space. We're going to have a public conference in Los Angeles this fall, and we're going to have our launch conference next April in New York City. Everything got screwed up because of the pandemic, but the Center for Political Innovation is looking to have a conference in November in Los Angeles, a public event. So, more information coming on that event once we have the location nailed down and stuff. It's going to be a great event. There's going to be musicians there and such. So it's going to be great. But go to the website, cpi-usa.org. Register, fill out forms, tell us you want to get involved in the CPI, and we'll get back to you. It's not really, the organization has not yet officially launched as an organization, but we need to build the Center for Political Innovation. We need new thinking and innovation and discussion of socialism. So, and another way you can help the CPI is you can order your own copy of the Green Book, our first published book, and you can help distribute the book. If you want to become a distributor, send me an email, and I'll arrange for you to become a distributor. You can get the books at a much lower price and help us distribute them. So, on that note, excuse me. Whoa. Alrighty. On that note, I'm going to read you my introduction to the Green Book. Sorry about that, folks. I just got a little choked up there. Alrighty. So this is Gaddafi's Green Book, and I'm going to read you my introduction to it. Introduction by Caleb Maupin. All right. The history of the African nation of Libya stands as one of the strongest indictments of imperialism and Western capitalism, as well as one of the strongest testaments to the strength of socialism. Prior to 1969, Libyans were a colonized people. The Italians ruled over them from 1911 to 1943. After the Second World War, a British-backed autocratic monarchy was imposed on the country. Western corporations began enriching themselves with the nation's petroleum resources, while the population remained deeply impoverished and the country remained underdeveloped and agrarian. This all changed in 1969, when Libya had a socialist revolution. With the birth of the Libyan Arab Republic, and eventually the Islamic Socialist Jamahiriya, this impoverished country saw dramatic and rapid improvements in living conditions. The Green Revolution involved a redistribution of land and public control of oil resources. The new socialist government began to control banking and closely regulate the price of food and other necessities. This is from the Green Book. In 1969, the gross domestic product of Libya was $3.8 billion, but by 1974, it was $13.7 billion. And by 1979, it had grown to be $24.5 billion. Housing was guaranteed to the population, and shanty towns were replaced by modern housing units. The country was fully electrified, and illiteracy was wiped out. Public education was provided to the population, and new universities were constructed. By 1978, Libya had twice as many doctors and hospitals as it had prior to the revolution. Also, women were guaranteed equality under the Libyan constitution and began participating in the government. New laws protected girls from being sold into marriages or otherwise treated as chattel. The population was organized into a network of revolutionary committees that enforced the goals of the socialist revolution on a local level. Libya began working towards the goal of becoming an independent nation in terms of food by greening the desert and creating farmland. In August of 1984, the first stone was laid, and the process of building the world's largest irrigation system began. The great man-made river would grow to be the largest network of pipes and aqueducts in the world, supplying fresh water across the country through the desert and enabling vast agricultural expansion. The man at the center of Libya's vast transformation was Muammar Mohammed Abu Minyar Gaddafi. Gaddafi was born to an illiterate family of Bedouin. Because his parents could not read or write, they kept no birth records, and the date of his birth is unknown. Though Gaddafi's father was not educated, he made great sacrifices to send his son to school. In order to attend school, the young Gaddafi slept in a mosque. He only saw his family on weekends and on holidays and had to travel 20 miles in order to do so. As an impoverished Bedouin, he faced bullying and humiliation by his city-dwelling classmates. However, he had many Egyptian teachers who told him about dramatic events happening in their homeland. Even as a child, Gaddafi became enthusiastic about politics. He admired Gamal Abdel Nasser, the Arab socialist who had taken power in Egypt. He opposed Israel and Zionism and felt great pride in the fact that members of his family had battled against the Italian occupiers. Before Gaddafi was even 20 years old, he was spending his free time putting up anti-imperialist posters and organizing demonstrations against the king, who was a puppet of the US and Britain. In response to his activism, Gaddafi's family was banned from the city of Saba and was forced to relocate to Misrata. Soon, Gaddafi found himself in the Royal Academy in Benghazi, rising up the ranks. He was recognized by his teachers and classmates for his exceptional intelligence. Despite being a high-achieving student, Gaddafi hated the British instructors at the military academy, believing that they disrespected Libyan culture and Islam. As a military officer, Gaddafi formed a secret society inspired by the patriotic officers that were organized throughout the Arab world. They had a network of clandestine cells where military men who hated imperialism and loved their homeland took an oath and conspired to seize power. The Libyan revolution began with the working class. Oil workers went on strike, demanding better pay and conditions. The population supported the oil workers, with protests and rebellions erupting across the country. On September 1st, 1969, the patriotic officers swung into motion and seized government buildings. The Crown Prince was arrested, and soon Gaddafi was on TV declaring to the country that the revolution would lead Libya toward freedom, socialism, and unity. Of course, Gaddafi has been subject to extreme ridicule and demonization by the voices that represent the Western imperialists and capitalists that he drove out of Libya. They portray him much like they portray Kim Jong-un or Fidel Castro, as if he is some kind of ignorant buffoon with tyrannical powers. However, Gaddafi's life illustrates that he was a brilliant statesman and politician. In the early years of the revolution, the country's new strongman was quite frustrated by the lack of progress. In both 1971 and 1973, he attempted to step down because he was tired of dealing with corruption and slow-moving bureaucracy. Both times, he was brought back to office by popular demand, with mass protests and public outcry demanding his return. On April 16, 1973, Gaddafi launched the Popular Revolution. The aim was to transform Libya into a fully socialist state. A few months later, in June of 1973, he published The Green Book. This book explains the form of socialism applied in Libya. Gaddafi was not a Marxist, though he clearly drew heavily from Marxism-Leninism and had thoroughly studied it. Gaddafi was not a Ba'athist either. However, he was greatly inspired by these movements in the region. Proof of Gaddafi's brilliance can be found in his writings. Exposing the fraudulent nature of democracy in many countries, he wrote, quote, "Under such systems, the people are the victims, whose votes are vied for by exploitative competing factions who dupe the people into political circuses that are outwardly noisy and frantic, but inwardly powerless and irrelevant. Alternatively, the people are seduced into standing in long, apathetic, silent queues to cast their ballots in the same way they throw waste paper into dustbins, Lenin's criteria of imperialism, and does it apply to Russia? Okay, writing it down. Okay. This is the traditional democracy prevalent in the whole world, whether it's represented by a one-party, two-party, multi-party, or non-party system. For Gaddafi, democracy was about bringing ordinary people into the political process. He writes, popular conferences are the only means to achieve popular democracy. Any system of government contrary to this method, the method of popular conferences, is undemocratic. True democracy has but one method and one theory. The dissimilarity and diversity of systems claiming to be democratic do, in fact, provide evidence that they are not so. The authority of the people has one face, which can only be realized through popular conferences and people's committees. There can be no democracy without popular conferences and committees everywhere. The people become the instrument of the government, and the dilemma of democracy in the world is conclusively solved. He exposes the myth of freedom of the press in a society where a small group of capitalists control the major media. He writes, an individual who has the right to express himself or herself, even if she behaves irrationally or demonstrates his or her insanity. Corporate bodies, too, have the right to express their corporate identity. The former represent only themselves, and the latter represent only those who share their corporate identity. Since society consists of private individuals and corporate bodies, the expression, for example, by an individual of his or her insanity does not mean that other members of society are insane. Such expressions reflect only in the individual's character. Likewise, corporate expression reflect only the interests and the views of those making up the corporate body. For instance, a tobacco company, despite the fact that what it produces is harmful to health, expresses the interests of those who make up the company. The press is a means of expression for society. It is not a means of expression for private individuals and corporate bodies. Therefore, logically and democratically, it should not be either one of them. He calls for publicly controlled and accountable media that puts the people's interests first, writing, the democratic process is that which is issued by the People's Committee, comprising all the groups of society. Only in this case, and not otherwise, will the press or any other information medium be democratic, expressing the viewpoints of the whole of society and representing all of its groups. When discussing economics, Gaddafi emphasizes that workers must be co-owners of the enterprises in which they toil. Writing, wage owners are but slaves to the masters who hire them. They are temporary slaves, but their slavery lasts as long as they work for the wages of employers, be they individuals or the state. The worker's relationship to the owner or the productive establishment and their own interests is similar under all prevailing conditions in the world, regardless of whether ownership is right or left. Even publicly owned establishments give workers wages, as well as other social benefits, similar to the charity endowed by rich owners of economic establishments upon those who work for them. The transformation of existing societies of wage earners into those of partners is inevitable as a dialectical outcome of the contradictory economic theories prevailing in the world today. It is also a dialectical outcome of the unjust relationship based on the wage system. None of these issues have been resolved to date. Gaddafi's writings will remind American readers of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's statements about freedom from want and his description of the need to eradicate poverty. He writes, the freedom of all human beings is lacking if he or her needs are controlled by others. For needs may lead to the enslavement of a person by another. Furthermore, exploitation is caused by need. Need is an intrinsic problem, and conflict is initiated by control of one another's needs. Gaddafi's third universal theory is a unique understanding of socialism. It rejects capitalism, but also opposes Marxism. It draws heavily from Islam and the collective traditions of Bedouin culture. Despite identifying with Arab culture, Gaddafi sees the people of Africa as the future. In a section of the book entitled "Black People Will Prevail in the World," he writes, "The latest age of slavery has been the enslavement of blacks by white people. The memory of this age will persist in the thinking of black people until they have vindicated themselves. This tragic and historic event, resulting in bitter feeling and the yearning of the vindication of a whole race, constitutes a psychological motivation for black people to vengeance and triumph that cannot be disregarded. In addition, the inevitable cycle of history, which also includes the yellow people's domination of the world when it marched from Asia, and white people carrying out wide-ranging colonial movements covering all continents of the world, is now giving way to the re-emergence of black people." Gaddafi also champions the liberation of women, writing, "There is no difference between men and women in all of the concerns of humanity. None of them should marry the other against his or her will, or divorce without just trial or mutual agreement. Neither should a woman remarry without such agreement or divorce, nor a man without divorce or consent. All societies today look upon women as little more than commodities. The East regards her as a commodity to be bought and sold, while the West does not recognize her femininity." Gaddafi's views on issues such as race and gender were amazingly progressive at the time he wrote this book. The US-aligned autocracy in Saudi Arabia only legalized the act of women driving cars in 2018. Furthermore, contempt for African people and declarations that they are inferior remain widespread among US-aligned regimes in the Arab world, even today. Gaddafi's views are certainly more traditional than those of the Western liberal activists in 2020, but the contents of this book were groundbreaking. It empowered millions of dark-skinned Libyans who were being treated as subhuman, and it also enabled Libyan women to participate in the governing process. The centuries-old practices of discrimination and dehumanization were significantly uprooted by having a progressive-minded Islamic socialist reformer as head of state. While Gaddafi drew heavily from Islam, his government was also considered to be secular by the Muslim Brotherhood and by adherents of Wahhabism. Religious minorities prospered in Libya, with Coptic and Catholic Christians openly practicing their faith. Despite being generally friendly to Christians, Gaddafi did make a point of converting the Tripoli Cathedral into a mosque as a symbolic victory over the European colonizers who built the church in 1920. In 2011, amid the Arab Spring protests, a barrage of videos and reports swept U.S. mainstream media, as well as Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Gaddafi was said to be a brutal dictator, and his people were supposedly in revolt against him. The former first prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Luis Morena Ocampo, proclaimed, "We have information that there was a policy to rape in Libya those who were against the government. Apparently, Gaddafi used it to punish people." Hillary Clinton declared rape, physical intimidation, and sexual harassment, and even so-called virginity tests have taken place in countries throughout the region. The allegations got uglier, and after the dust settled, NATO bombs had destroyed the prosperous African country, after that, the claims were largely debunked. While many outlets reported that Gaddafi was issuing Viagra to his soldiers and ordering them to rape women, Donatella Rovira, a senior crisis advisor for Amnesty International, reported that these claims could not be confirmed. She reported, after her organization had investigated, that, quote, "We have not found any evidence or a single victim of rape or a doctor who knew about somebody being raped." Laisel Gernfoltz, who was sent to Libya to investigate as head of the Women's Rights Division at Human Rights Watch, said, "We have not been able to find any evidence." Many of the crowds described in international media as peaceful protesters had in fact been armed and fired on Libyan soldiers. Amnesty International backed up a report from the International Crisis Group, writing, "Much of Western media coverage has from the outset been a very one-sided view of the logic of events, portraying the protest movement as entirely peaceful and repeatedly suggesting that the regime's security forces were unaccountably massacring demonstrators who presented no security challenge. Journalist Patrick Cockburn of the UK Independent raised the alarm in June of 2011 with an article entitled "Amnesty Questions Claims that Gaddafi Ordered Rape as a Weapon of War," but his revelations were largely ignored. The US media wanted regime change in Libya. Rumors of atrocities and claims from anti-Gaddafi fanatics filled the airwaves. There is no question that Libya did not have the level of human rights found in Western countries. Gaddafi was often quite ruthless with opponents who sought to violently overturn the Islamic socialist system. The security forces and the popular committees in neighborhoods and on university campuses were known to monitor and intimidate people considered to be problematic. One of the most outspoken advocates for democratic reform and human rights in Libya was Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, Muammar's son. Saif emphatically declared on many occasions that he had no interest in becoming his father's successor, as Libya was, quote, not a farm to inherit. Many times, Gaddafi's family members met with student dissidents and others who had grievances, especially when the fighting began in 2011. Efforts were made to bring dissenters into the governing process and allow them to participate in adjusting Libya's political system to be more in their favor. However, the US-backed extremists and armed foreign fighters had no interest in dialogue. The war in Libya was not about human rights. Foreign fighters from across the Islamic world were pouring in for the purpose of overthrowing the socialist government. Reports filled the Arab media claiming that Gaddafi had a non-Muslim girlfriend and that he drank alcohol. Their main grievance was not that Gaddafi violated human rights or tortured his opponents, but that he was secular. Videos began surfacing of wealthy anti-Gaddafi Libyans lynching dark-skinned African guest workers. A New York Times headline from September 5th, 2011 reads, quote, "Libyans turn wrath on dark-skinned migrants." Racism was a central plank of the anti-Gaddafi forces, with slogans like "Gaddafi is killing us with his Africans," taken up by anti-Gaddafi fighters. The gruesome manner of the street mob killings carried out by Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton's quote-unquote revolutionaries shocked the world. Dark-skinned migrant workers were targeted because many wealthy Libyans resented the fact that Gaddafi had worked on behalf of people that they deemed to be inferior. Millions of Libyans rallied to support Islamic socialism. Armed green militias, in which women took the lead, fought off the foreign fighters. The NATO bombing campaign was conducted because the Islamic socialist forces were winning on the ground. In battle after battle, the armed population, loyal to Gaddafi, was victorious. Obama instituted a no-fly zone and then unleashed a horrendous bombing campaign because his proxies on the ground, armed and trained by the CIA and European intelligence, were being defeated. If the intent of Western capitalist powers was to help the Libyan people with a humanitarian intervention, they utterly failed. Conditions in Libya have not improved, but gotten far worse. Much of the country's infrastructure has been destroyed. Even now, 9 years after the US NATO intervention that destroyed the socialist government and killed Qaddafi, conditions in the country are still dire. Libyans are still fleeing. According to the World Health Organization's statement from May 13th, 2020, since the start of this year, more than 3,200 people, Green Book, more than 3,200 people have been intercepted at the sea and returned to Libya. Many end up in one of the 11 official detention centers. Others have been taken to facilities or unofficial detention centers to which the humanitarian community does not have access. The United Nations has repeatedly reiterated that Libya is not a safe port and that the persons rescued at sea should not be returned to arbitrary detention. Women and children continue to bear the brunt of armed conflict in Libya. Over the past year, the United Nations has verified 113 cases of grave violations, including killing and maiming of children, attacks on schools and health facilities. Hospitals and health facilities have been targeted by shelling, further disrupting Libya's fragile healthcare system. Since the beginning of the year, at least 15 attacks have damaged health facilities and ambulances and injured healthcare workers. These attacks are a blatant violation of international humanitarian law and even more egregious during the COVID-19 pandemic. Since 2013, over 700,000 people have crossed from Libya over the Mediterranean to Italy to flee the chaos and fighting. Hundreds have died in the process trying to reach Italy. Among the US-backed fighters who came to Libya to overthrow socialism was Katiba al-Batar al-Libi. This organization swore allegiance to ISIS in 2014 after Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi declared he had restored the caliphate in Mosul. On May 22, 2017, 23 people were killed in Britain's Manchester Arena after a suicide bomber detonated a homemade explosive device at the concert. The perpetrator was Salman Ramadan Abedi, a 22-year-old Libyan who fought against socialism alongside his father. Both the bomber and his father had fought with the Islamic fighting group in Libya, helping to overthrow the Islamic Socialist government, led by Qaddafi, and then returned to live in the United Kingdom. It is reported that Abedi learned how to make bombs and other devices from Libyan anti-socialist fighters that were backed by the United States. Libya's oil exports have drastically decreased to less than 10% of what they were prior to 2011, when oil revenue laid the basis for the socialist government's construction projects and providing for the population. Libya serves as a case study not only of socialism's success, but the utter failure of capitalism. Much like Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya has in no way benefited from efforts of the United States to conduct regime change. The adoption of Western capitalism, joining the open international system, has not improved the lives of the people. When Libya was besieged by US-backed foreign fighters, dubbed revolutionaries by Western media, and later attacked with NATO bombs, Barack Obama was in his first presidential term. The Arab Spring and anti-austerity protests were in full swing. As protesters in New York City unfurled placards that said, "Fight like an Egyptian," many believed that somehow this armed revolt, backed by Western capitalism to overthrow a socialist government, was somehow a good thing. Veteran 1960s counterculture activists, who identify more with the movement than with Marxism, were mesmerized by the Guevara-esque aesthetics on Al Jazeera and on social media. Because New Left politics had replaced economics and historical materialism with laments about alienation and freedom, found in the works of Sontag, Arendt, and Adorno, the Marxist movement showed very little solidarity. Most leftist groups, Trotskyists, anarchists, and social democrats, cheered the so-called Libyan revolution led by armed CIA thugs, though they gave mild, symbolic denunciations of the bombing once cruise missiles started to fly. Only a minority of Marxists opposed the bombing of Libya. They tended to be anti-revisionists who admired Mao or Stalin, and they were roundly denounced as tankies and Stalinists who, quote, support dictators, by the prominent voices representing leftism. The strongest opposition to the bombing of Libya came from black nationalists. The Nation of Islam convened a rally of tens of thousands of people in Harlem in which Minister Louis Farrakhan rallied the crowd to oppose the bombing. Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney visited Libya during the war and spoke strongly against the U.S.-backed regime change operation, as did former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark. Even among those who opposed the bombing, a childish effort to distance themselves from Gaddafi was displayed. As the Libyan socialist government was fighting for its life and thousands were being killed, Joyce Chediak of the Workers' World Party wrote this analysis of socialism in Libya. Quote, "They are nationalist because they seek to develop their countries free of imperialist domination. They are bourgeois because they are ruled by an exploiting class of capitalists. Marxists support these governments against imperialism because they are manifestations of self-determination for the oppressed. This does not mean that Marxists support every policy of these governments. Marxists also recognize that these regimes have a, quote, dual character." You're very welcome, John Edwards. "Bourgeois nationalists seek to push out the imperialists so they can better exploit their workers. But they have a common interest with the workers when imperialism threatens the country. These governments cannot consistently fight imperialism. However, only the working class can." Workers' World, May 11th, 2011. Did Muammar Gaddafi and the millions who joined with him to risk their lives and carry out a revolution and construct a socialist government do so in order to, quote, better exploit the workers? Who was it who made up the popular conferences and popular committees that laid the basis for the Libyan socialist state, if not overwhelmingly members of Libya's working class? If Joyce Chediak really understood the conflict in Libya, she would see that the exploiting class of capitalists were Gaddafi's greatest enemies, and it was mobilizing the Libyan people to control them and often seize their property that laid the basis for the social transformation of Libya. To dismiss Libya as nationalist is also a vast mischaracterization. The Libyan socialist government stood out for its record of internationalism. Libya supported the Palestinians, the African National Congress, the Irish Republican Army, the Black Panthers, and many people around the world who struggled for justice and liberation. Libya's record of international solidarity was one of the main reasons it was targeted and accused of being a state sponsor of terrorism by the United States. The underlying motivation for this statement, as the author can attest as a member of the Workers' World Party at the time of its publication, was an attempt to maintain credibility. Joyce Chediak, like Fred Goldstein, Deirdre Griswold, and Larry Holmes, all maintained a movementist mindset. Despite understanding the basics of Marxism-Leninism, they had spent the bulk of their lives attempting to position themselves as stage managers of Washington, D.C. peace rallies. While they knew the bombing of Libya was wrong, they hoped to win credibility with Rachel Maddow fans and Obama supporters by making clear that their socialism was somehow different than the bourgeois nationalism of Gaddafi. Furthermore, they held on to an ideological orientation that was frozen in time from the Cold War. Because Libya, like Syria or the Bolivarian countries of Latin America, was not an explicitly Marxist-Leninist one-party state, it could not, therefore, be socialist. In short, these denunciations were issued because defending Libya's achievements or emphasizing the socialistic basis of the economy was not a winning strategy in recruiting from the movement of liberal activists. At the time, Gaddafi was being portrayed as a homophobe, a misogynist, and in some cases an Islamophobe in mainstream U.S. media. Obama's liberal, social justice-oriented administration was bombing Libya supposedly to liberate people from a demagogue. However, it never occurred to Chediak, Goldstein, Griswold, and Holmes to look beyond the movement, not just to oppose the war, but to build a socialist movement in the United States. Middle-class liberals are not the only milieu from whom socialists can recruit. On the day Gaddafi died, October 20th, 2011, this writer was in Zuccotti Park. Occupy Wall Street was at that point in full swing. In the park, the most prominent voices offered no sympathy for Gaddafi. Professional activists with liberal, social democratic, and anarchist perspectives were not the only perspectives represented in the movement, however. Many young people, unemployed from across the country, had come to Zuccotti Park to protest Wall Street. Midwestern and Southern youths, despite being ideologically confused and sometimes libertarian in their perspective, understood that Gaddafi was on their side. Among young people in Zuccotti Park, it was well known that Gaddafi had sought to create an independent African currency, an affront to the US dollar and the Federal Reserve bankers. Cynthia McKinney's documentation of the Obama administration's lies about Libya were well known far beyond the movement because right-wing radio host Alex Jones had featured McKinney on his program and given her a platform that movement programs like Democracy Now! Had not. The socialist movement in the United States, in the aftermath of the new communist movement of the 1970s, and most especially after the fall of the Soviet Union, had retreated from the broad masses of people. It occupies various safe spaces like academia, the labor bureaucracy, and middle-class pockets within the urban centers. It has come to see the broad masses of people as an enemy, and populism, i.e., attempts to mobilize the broad masses of people, as a great danger. However, the history of the socialist movement in the United States tells a very different story. The strength of Eugene Debs, the Socialist Party, the Communist Party, the Black Panther Party, was their ability to mobilize millions of people around a socialist program designed to improve living conditions and meet the needs of the people. Socialists did not become strong by embedding themselves among liberal activists, but by going directly to the masses and providing aid and leadership amid times of economic hardship. Leftist politics, where it has been successful in places like Libya, has always been populist in its orientation. Marx wrote about the proletariat and its struggle to seize the means of production from the bourgeoisie and organize the economy to serve public good rather than profits. The strength of communists has always been their ability to organize the most downtrodden in society by emphasizing class solidarity. Communists opposed racism with the slogan, "Black and white unite and fight." Communists were able to win millions of white workers to oppose Jim Crow segregation during the 1930s by explaining that racism hurt all working people and was a tool of the capitalist bosses. Communists did not speak of shaming and punishing people who held white privilege, but rather of the need to raise up all working people, giving special attention and priority to those who faced the worst discrimination. Gaddafi rejected Marxism, despite drawing from it and studying it throughout his life. However, the vast socialist movement he created in Libya that improved living conditions for the entire country. You should make an audiobook. That's what this is basically. I'll cut it. The vast socialist movement he created in Libya that improved living conditions for the entire country, mobilized millions into revolutionary councils and committees. Starting again, that paragraph again. Gaddafi rejected Marxism despite drawing from it and studying it throughout his life. However, the vast socialist movement he created in Libya that improved living conditions for the entire country mobilized millions into revolutionary councils and committees. Gaddafi vastly improved the status of women and dark-skinned Africans, and his revolution holds many lessons for socialists in any country, the United States included. The Green Book presented here is the primary ideological document written by a revolutionary who raised millions of people from poverty and created a prosperous socialist society. Prior to 2011, Libya was the top oil exporting country in Africa. According to the CIA World Factbook, Libya had the highest life expectancy on the African continent. It had taken tremendous strides to improve living conditions, granted people access to health care, education, and housing. The socialist state brought people into the political process with a network of popular conferences and committees, and emboldened many who had previously been downtrodden. Gaddafi is certainly worth criticizing, and many of his statements and actions could be considered problematic. But there is no doubt that he was a successful statesman and revolutionary, and there is no doubt that the society he constructed was in fact a socialist one. From 1969 to 2011, Libya was free from Western capitalism. It was on an independent course of Western development, with an economy that was centrally planned to serve public good, not profits. The Green Book, presented here in the official Libyan government translation, because no copyright exists, is an important document for any serious revolutionary to understand. In our times, dogmatic ideological recitations are not needed. Be they Marxist, Leninist, Stalinist, Trotskyist, Maoist, Hoxhaist, or whatnot. In order to construct 21st century socialism, all great revolutionary figures must be studied. All attempts to get beyond capitalism should be thoroughly investigated, and none should be blindly defended or copied. This book was published in order to introduce the millions of Americans who are becoming interested in socialism to the revolutionary government of Libya that existed from 1969 to 2011. It is published to preserve the thoughts of a high-achieving individual who played a dynamic role in world politics. The Center for Political Innovation hopes to publish many more such books, presenting the views of revolutionary figures from past times. In doing so, we hope to inspire the conversations that will lead toward new political developments in our time and point the way out of greed, fascism, and war toward a more humane and prosperous future. And that is my introduction to the Green Book. This is the new edition of the Green Book, published by the Center for Political Innovation, with a new introduction by Caleb Maupin. I felt it would be good to just read it to you. And what's neat is my friend Ramiro, he laid it out. Ramiro's a great guy. I've known him for a long time. And he put a picture of Gaddafi in the front. I think that's pretty neat. It's almost like the Little Red Book where they have the picture of Mao in the front. He laid it out beautifully. And this is the first book published by the Center for Political Innovation, CPI. And that's our logo for the Center for Political Innovation. And we, unlike, here's the thing. I just want to throw this out there before I get to that last super chat. Amazon, they print books that aren't copyrighted, right, that are old or whatever. They print their own editions of them, and a lot of them are crap. Like, look, we have a nice table of contents here, right? Introduction by Caleb Maupin. We even have the graphics, the original graphics from the Green Book. But like a lot of, if you buy a book that's not copyrighted on Amazon, there's a good chance it won't have page numbers. There's a good chance that it'll be the size of an atlas. I mean, Amazon puts out a lot of crap books, because it's not a bookstore. You can't actually look at it. But I'm going to make sure, I will personally make sure that every book the Center for Political Innovation puts out has a beautiful introduction. It's got a nice, beautiful cover. It's well laid out. It has table of contents. It has readable text. Amazon ripped me off. I bought a copy. I wanted to read. I've been studying psychology, so I bought a copy of a book called The Varieties of Religious Experience by William James. And I got it. It finally came. I paid $14 for it. I opened the Amazon package. It's the size of a freaking atlas. It's this big, and it has no page numbers. It has a table of contents with page numbers, but there's no page numbers on the page. I was furious. I got ripped off. I couldn't read that book. Well, I'm going to make sure that the CPI, the Center for Political Innovation edition of these books, which you can order, is high quality. We're not going to have a Jeff Bezos ripoff. So there you go. Okay. Now there was one more super chat, which I'll answer, and then I'll answer any other questions, and then we'll be done. My voice is giving out here. I think that coughing fit kind of rejuvenated my voice. It was weird. But when I swallowed the water and it went down the wrong pipe, all of a sudden I had I had more energy. Okay, all right. So the last question was about Lenin's definition of imperialism And does it apply to Russia? Okay, so Lenin's definition of imperialism is when banking capital takes priority over industrial capital, and there emerges great cartels, and trusts and centralization, where industries are centered around banks, where there's a few monopolies that dominate the domestic markets, and then those monopolies start expanding over the world and carving out territories and spheres of influence, right? That's what imperialism is. And the imperialists then go to developing countries and prevent development and dump their excess products on developing countries and use the developing countries as captive markets. That's basically what imperialism is, right? It's the formation of giant trusts and monopolies, carving out spheres of influence, export of capital. Lenin wrote a book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. He also, he laid it out, the thesis of what imperialism is in his book, or in his text. His first essay on it was called Imperialism and the Split in Socialism. Well, Russia's not imperialist for the simple reason that Russia's economy is not about, having trusts and cartels that carve out the world in spheres of influence and dump their excess products. Russia's economy is it's mainly centered around oil and gas. Russia, there's two giant state-controlled mega corporations, Gazprom and Rosneft. And Russia, sells oil and gas on the international markets. That goes into the public budget. And they use the public budget to finance other industries like titanium, like nuclear power and stuff like that. So that's not how Russia's economy works. It doesn't work according to Lenin's definition of imperialism. And a lot of what Russia does around the world is try to strengthen the economies of its allies. For example, people say that the fact that, Russia in Syria, right, Gazprom and Rosneft have partnered with Syria's natural gas and energy companies. That's not imperialism, right? If it was imperialism, Russia would be trying to put Syria's energy companies out of business and force them to import their natural gas and oil from Russia. Russia is working with the Syrian government to build up. It's like a partnership where Russia is trying to strengthen and expand oil and gas production in Syria. That doesn't work. That's just not the reality. Another example is the fact that in many African countries, the state-run Dugin is a hardline Eurasianist. How is Eurasianism anti-imperialist? I told you I'm not going to do any Dugin questions. I've talked way too much about Dugin on here. I'm not going to do any Dugin questions. I'm not going to answer any questions about bad quesadilla, and I'm not going to answer any more questions about Dugin. I've addressed Dugin about 100 times, and I'm not going to talk about it. So there you go. But yeah, Russia's economy, in a lot of African countries, for example, Russia's state-owned mining firms have a partnership with the state-owned mining firms of the African countries. And again, it's not Russia trying to put their mining firms out of business. It's the opposite. It's Russia building up these mining firms. Russia in Africa, its role is the opposite. The imperialists impoverish African countries and force them to import all their products from the West. Russia builds up the domestic industries of African countries, a lot like China does. So the economics of imperialism, the actual economics of imperialism, clearly don't apply to Russia. It just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. And I'm sorry, if you define imperialism as economic relations, yes, Russia has economic relations with different countries. If you define imperialism as influence or having influence or a military presence or whatever, maybe you can have a case there. But imperialism, the economic definition of imperialism, which is what the Super Chat was specifically about, the economic definition of imperialism, right, where trusts and monopolies carve out spheres of influence and no, it just isn't that way. I'm sorry, but that's just not how the Russian economy works. It's not an imperialist economy. Russia controls its own natural resources and it exports them around the world and has used that to build up other industries. And those industries then have partnerships with other industries where they're mutually beneficial. Syria's natural gas apparatus and oil apparatus is expanding because of Russia. The same with African countries and mining. I've been to economic conferences. I've sat in the room. I was at the Yalta Economic Forum in Crimea. I've been to many different, I was at the World Festival of Youth and Students. I was at the Valdi Discussion Club in Sochi. I have sat with these business people, and these business people are all tied in with the government, and it is not imperialism. It's just simply not imperialism. It's a different economic model. So take it or leave it. I don't expect you to believe me, right? But I'm just telling you that's how it is. So All right, are there any more questions that people want to ask before we call it a night? It's been a long live, but it's been a good live. We've talked about a lot of topics. Any other questions people would like to ask? Last chance. Last chance. Last chance, folks. Any other questions that people have on their minds? All righty. If not, then I think we'll wrap it up here. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. We need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government of action to fight for working families. Best wishes, everyone. Have a good night.